Welcome, weary traveler of history, to another evening of deliberately tedious yet fascinating tales from the ancient world. Tonight, you will drift through the methodical, exhaustively detailed life of Gaius Julius Caesar, man whose existence was far more consumed by bureaucratic minutiae, endless correspondence, and the grinding machinery of Roman politics than the dramatic flourishes Hollywood might have you believe. We shall explore not the thrilling moments of conquest, but the patient, methodical accumulation of power through forms filed in triplicate, grain requisitions, and the sort of administrative tedium that built an empire. Our journey through Caesar's life unfolds in 4 carefully structured stories, each examining the painstaking details that historians often gloss over in favor of more spectacular narratives. We will linger in the mundane moments that reveal the true nature of Roman political machinery, the endless negotiations that preceded every decision, and the bureaucratic persistence that transformed a moderately wealthy patrician into the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world in the year 100 BCE, on either the 12th or 13th day of Julius A, a detail that would later become monumentally relevant to the very calendar you use today. Child was born into the grinding bureaucracy of Roman aristocracy. His full name, Gaius Julius Caesar, carried with it not the promise of future greatness, but rather the mundane expectation of political paperwork, religious duties, and the sort of methodical career advancement that characterized every ambitious Roman of his class. The Julius Caesars were patricians, members of Rome's original aristocracy, yet they were neither wealthy nor particularly influential. They claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, a genealogical assertion that required no small amount of bureaucratic documentation and religious validation. By Caesar's time, the patrician status that once guaranteed political advantage had become something of a bureaucratic handicap. Patricians were barred from holding the tribunate of the plebs, that paradoxically powerful office that had become essential for ambitious politicians seeking to bypass the traditional limitations of Roman law. Young Gaius grew up in Sabora, a neighborhood that was neither the most fashionable nor the most squalid in Rome, but rather occupied that perfectly unremarkable middle ground that characterized much of his early life. His father, also named Gaius Caesar, died when the boy was 16, leaving him to be raised primarily by his mother, Aurelia. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable intelligence and political acumen, qualities that would prove far more valuable to her son's career than any inheritance of gold or property. The Rome of Caesar's youth was dominated by the administrative aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship, a period when the very machinery of government had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to the whims of one man's vision of constitutional order. Sulla had increased the number of criminal courts, expanded the Senate, and instituted a series of laws designed to prevent future strongmen from accumulating the sort of power he himself had wielded. It was into this world of carefully calibrated checks and balances that young Caesar would learn to navigate, spending countless hours studying not just rhetoric and philosophy, but the intricate details of Roman law and procedure. Caesar's early education followed the traditional Roman pattern, learning to read and write Latin and Greek, studying mathematics and basic engineering, and most importantly, memorizing the vast corpus of Roman legal precedent that governed everything from property disputes to provincial administration. He spent his adolescent years in the company of tutors who drilled him relentlessly in the art of public speaking, not because oratory was considered a noble pursuit, but because it was the fundamental tool of Roman political life. Every law had to be proposed in the Senate. Every legal case had to be argued before judges. Every military command had to be justified to the people. The ability to speak persuasively was not an artistic embellishment, but a practical necessity, as essential as knowing how to read a balance sheet or calculate the grain. Requirements for a legion on campaign when Caesar reached the age of 16. He found himself thrust prematurely into the role of head of household, responsible not just for his own career, but for managing the family's modest estate and navigating the complex web of obligations that connected his family to the broader Roman aristocracy. This meant maintaining correspondence with dozens of political contacts, attending religious ceremonies in his capacity as a member of various priestly colleges, and beginning the slow process of building the network of relationships that would sustain his political career. The most significant event of these early years was Caesar's marriage to Cornelia, daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who had been one of Marius's most prominent supporters during the civil wars. This marriage was not a romantic gesture, but a calculated political alliance, linking Caesar's family to the Marian faction at a time when such connections were both dangerous and potentially lucrative. When Sulla returned to power and began his systematic persecution of Marius's supporters, Caesar found himself in the uncomfortable position of being ordered to divorce his wife as a demonstration of loyalty to the new regime. Caesar's refusal to comply with this order was not, as later historians would suggest, a dramatic gesture of romantic devotion, but rather a carefully calculated political decision. He understood that Sulla's power, however absolute it might seem, was ultimately temporary. Dictatorships in Rome traditionally lasted only 6 months, and even Sulla's unprecedented extension of the office would eventually come to an end. By maintaining his marriage to Cornelia, Caesar was essentially placing a long-term bet on the eventual rehabilitation of the Marian faction, while simultaneously demonstrating to potential supporters that he was a man who honored his commitments, even when doing so involved considerable personal risk. The consequences of this decision were predictably bureaucratic in their tedium. Caesar was stripped of his inheritance, removed from his position as Flamen Dialis, a priesthood of Jupiter, that carried with it significant political privileges, and effectively blacklisted from holding any significant office under Sulla's regime. Rather than dramatically fleeing Rome or organizing armed resistance, Caesar simply ... left. He departed for Asia Minor to serve on the staff of Marcus Minucius Thermos, the praetor of Asia, where he would spend the next several years learning the practical details of provincial administration. This period of Caesar's life, often glossed over by historians eager to reach the more exciting portions of his career, was actually crucial to his later success. Working under Thermus, Caesar learned how the Roman Empire actually functioned at the ground level. He discovered how tax collection worked, how local disputes were resolved, how Roman law was adapted to local conditions, and how the vast bureaucratic machinery of imperial administration converted the abstract authority of Rome into concrete control over millions of people, living thousands of miles from the capital. Caesar's duties included supervising the collection of customs duties, mediating disputes between Roman merchants and local businessmen, and maintaining correspondence with officials throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. He learned to read and write contracts in Greek, became familiar with local banking practices, and developed an understanding of the complex trade networks that connected the various provinces of the empire. More importantly, he began to understand how information flowed through the Roman administrative system, how decisions made in Rome were transmitted to provincial governors, and how those governors adapted, modified, or sometimes simply ignored their instructions based on local conditions. This apprenticeship in the mundane realities of imperial administration would prove invaluable during Caesar's later career. While his contemporaries learned politics through the theatrical debates of the Roman Senate, Caesar was developing a practical understanding of how the empire actually worked. He was learning not just how to give speeches, but how to implement policies, not just how to win votes, but how to govern populations, not just how to make laws, but how to ensure those laws were actually enforced. Yet even as Caesar was mastering the bureaucratic arts that would later make him such an effective administrator, he was also demonstrating the sort of audacious personal initiative that would distinguish him. from his more conventionally minded contemporaries. The most famous example of this occurred during his journey to Rhodes, where he had planned to study rhetoric under the famous teacher Apollonius Molon. En route, Caesar's ship was captured by pirates, common hazard for travelers in the eastern Mediterranean, where the decline of effective naval policing had allowed piracy to flourish. The pirates' demand for 20 talents of silver as ransom was, Caesar informed them with characteristic arrogance, insultingly low for a man of his status. He suggested they increase their demand to 50 talents, simultaneously establishing his own importance and demonstrating his understanding of the economic realities of the ransom business, while his servants were dispatched to raise the money. Caesar spent the next 38 days as the pirates' prisoner, treating them more like hosts than captors. He demanded they remain quiet when he wished to sleep, participated in their games and exercises, and even wrote poetry which he recited to them, cheerfully informing them they were barbarians when they failed to appreciate his literary efforts. This behavior was not, despite later romanticization, an example of Caesar's natural charisma or fearless temperament. It was, rather, a calculated demonstration of Roman superiority and an investment in his own future reputation. Caesar understood that his treatment of this situation would be reported throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and he was carefully crafting a narrative that would enhance his political career. By treating the pirates with casual contempt rather than fear, he was establishing himself as a man of such confidence and authority that even desperate criminals recognized his inherent superiority. More practically, Caesar was also using his time in captivity to gather intelligence about the pirates' operations, their numbers, their ships, their bases, and their methods. When his ransom was finally paid and he was released, Caesar immediately traveled to Miletus, where he raised a fleet and recruited a force of volunteers. He then returned to the pirates' stronghold, captured the entire band, and recovered not only his own ransom, but also the considerable treasure they had accumulated from other victims. Most of the pirates he had crucified, though he did grant them the mercy of having their throats cut before crucifixion, a gesture of clemency that he made sure was widely reported. This entire episode, from capture to revenge, had taken less than 3 months, but it established several patterns that would characterize Caesar's later career. First, his ability to turn apparent disaster into opportunity for personal advancement. Second, his understanding that reputation was as important as achievement, and that both required careful management. Third, his willingness to take enormous personal risks when the potential rewards justified the dangers. And finally, his recognition that effective action required not just courage and determination, but also meticulous planning, adequate resources, and attention to practical details. But what made this piracy incident truly significant was not its drama, but its administrative aftermath. Caesar's unauthorized raising of a fleet and his execution of the pirates required extensive correspondence with Roman officials to justify his actions and secure retroactive approval for what amounted to private warfare. He had to file reports with the governor of Asia, seek confirmation from the Senate for his disposal of the recovered treasure, and navigate the complex legal questions surrounding his summary execution of Roman captives for pirates. Technically, could claim Roman citizenship if they had been born in Roman territory. These bureaucratic complications consumed months of Caesar's time and taught him invaluable lessons about the relationship between Roman law and Roman power. He learned that audacious action, even when successful, required subsequent bureaucratic validation to be politically useful. He discovered that the Roman legal system was sufficiently complex that almost any action could be challenged or defended, depending on how skillfully one navigated the relevant procedures. And he began to understand that reputation for effectiveness was often more important than strict adherence to legal precedent, provided one could manage the paperwork correctly afterward, as Caesar concluded his Eastern apprenticeship and prepared To return to Rome to begin his formal political career, he carried with him not just the conventional education of a Roman aristocrat, but also practical experience in administration, intelligence gathering, military organization, and the sort of creative problem-solving that would distinguish him from his more conventionally minded contemporaries. He had learned that success in Roman politics required not just the ability to give impressive speeches, but also the patience to master bureaucratic procedures, the intelligence to understand complex systems, and the audacity to take calculated risks when the potential rewards justified the dangers. Yet for all his unconventional experiences and precocious achievements, Caesar remained, as he prepared to launch his political career, simply one promising young aristocrat among many. His family name gave him access to Roman political life, but no guarantee of success within it. His Eastern adventures had enhanced his reputation, but had also marked him as someone who was perhaps too independent, too willing to improvise, too comfortable operating outside the traditional boundaries of Roman law and custom. As he sailed west toward Rome and the next phase of his career, Caesar faced the fundamental challenge that confronted every ambitious Roman politician: how to distinguish himself sufficiently to rise above the crowd without distinguishing himself so much that he appeared dangerous to the established order. The answer to that challenge would require not just political skill, but also a deep understanding of how Roman institutions actually functioned, how power actually flowed through the complex networks that connected senators and governors, generals and merchants, citizens and subjects throughout the Mediterranean world, and it would require, above all, the sort of methodical persistence that could sustain a career through decades of incremental advancement, procedural complications, and bureaucratic tedium. For success in Roman politics was not achieved through single moments of dramatic triumph, but through the patient accumulation of small advantages, carefully maintained relationships, and the sort of attention to detail that most historians, understandably, find too boring to describe at length. How then would this promising but still relatively obscure young man navigate the labyrinthine complexities of Roman political advancement to achieve the extraordinary power that would eventually be his? The answer lay not in any single moment of inspiration or decisive battle, but in the grinding day-to-day work of constituency building, alliance formation, and the mastery of procedural details that would occupy the next phase of his career. Upon Caesar's return to Rome in 78 BCE, following Sulla's death, he found a city transformed by the methodical restructuring of its institutions, yet still grappling with the bureaucratic aftermath of civil war. The Rome he encountered was a place where careers were built not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient accumulation of procedural victories, the careful cultivation of political relationships, and the sort of administrative competence that most citizens found profoundly uninteresting, but which formed the actual foundation of imperial power. Caesar's entry into Roman political life began with the traditional path of prosecution, not because he harbored any particular passion for legal justice, but because successful prosecution of prominent figures was the established method by which young aristocrats demonstrated their forensic skills and announced their availability for higher office. His targets were carefully chosen: prominent supporters of Sulla's regime, whose continued influence represented both a political obstacle and an opportunity for advancement. The cases themselves were tedious affairs, involving months of preparation, the examination of financial records, the interviewing of witnesses, and the sort of detailed legal research that required Caesar to spend countless hours in the archives, studying precedents and memorizing statutes. Each prosecution required not just a compelling speech delivered in court, but also extensive preliminary work, gathering evidence, securing witnesses, researching legal precedents, and building coalitions of supporters who could provide both financial backing and political cover. Caesar's prosecution of Gnaeus, Cornelius Dolabella for extortion during his governorship of Macedonia was typical of these early cases. The charges were straightforward. Dolabella had systematically looted his province, extracting illegal taxes, seizing private property, and demanding bribes for basic administrative services, but proving them required Caesar to reconstruct a complex paper trail of financial transactions, many of which had been deliberately obscured or destroyed. Caesar spent months interviewing Macedonian merchants, examining banking records, and coordinating with other prosecutors who were pursuing similar cases against other provincial governors. The trial itself, while dramatic in its final moments, was preceded by weeks of procedural maneuvering as both sides challenged jury selections, disputed the admissibility of evidence, and filed motions to delay or accelerate the proceedings. Caesar had to master not just the art of public speaking, but also the arcane rules that govern the conduct of Roman trials, the procedures for examining witnesses, and the complex regulations that determined which evidence could be presented and which must be excluded. Although Caesar lost this case, Dolabella's connections proved too strong, and his resources too extensive for a young prosecutor to overcome the trial established Caesar's reputation as a serious legal advocate, and demonstrated his willingness to take on powerful opponents. More importantly, it provided him with valuable experience in the practical workings of Roman justice and introduced him to the networks of merchants, bankers, and provincial administrators whose support would prove crucial to his later career. Following this initial foray into prosecution, Caesar made the decision that would distinguish him from most of his contemporaries, rather than immediately seeking higher office. He invested additional time in educational preparation, traveling to Rhodes to study rhetoric under Apollonius Milan, the same teacher who had trained Cicero. This decision reflected Caesar's understanding that success in Roman politics required not just ambition and connections, but also genuine intellectual preparation for the challenges of leadership. The journey to Rhodes, interrupted by his celebrated depleted encounter with pirates, was itself an exercise in the sort of meticulous planning that would characterize Caesar's later military campaigns. Travel in the eastern Mediterranean required careful coordination of shipping schedules, currency exchange, accommodation arrangements, and security precautions. Caesar had to prepare letters of introduction to Roman officials throughout the region, arrange for the transfer of funds to cover his expenses, and coordinate with local representatives who could provide both protection and logistical support. His studies under Milan involved not just rhetorical exercises, but also intensive work in Greek philosophy, mathematics, and what we would now call political science. Caesar studied the constitutional arrangements of various Greek city-states, examined the administrative systems of Hellenistic kingdoms, and analyzed the military organization of successful ancient commanders. This was not idle academic pursuits, but practical preparation for the challenges of governing a diverse, complex empire that included Greek cities, Gallic tribes, Egyptian kingdoms, and dozens of other distinct political entities. More importantly, Caesar's time in Rhodes provided him with extensive contacts throughout the Greek-speaking world, relationships that would prove invaluable during his later military campaigns. He developed friendships with local bankers who could arrange currency transfers, merchants who could provide intelligence about political conditions throughout the region, and scholars who could serve as translators and advisors when he later governed provinces with predominantly Greek populations. Upon his return to Rome, Caesar faced the fundamental challenge of every aspiring politician: securing his first significant office in the cursus honorum, the structured sequence of political positions through which ambitious Romans advanced toward the consulship. His election to the military tribunate was achieved through the sort of methodical constituency building that characterized Roman electoral politics: months of personal visits to potential supporters, carefully negotiated alliances with more established politicians, and the provision of financial support to voters in the form of public entertainment and private gifts. The military tribunate itself was largely administrative, involving the supervision of recruitment, the organization of supply systems, and the coordination of training exercises. Caesar spent his tenure learning the practical details of how Roman legions actually functioned, how soldiers were equipped and fed, how officers were selected and trained, how orders were transmitted and executed, and how the vast logistical apparatus of the Roman military converted resources into military power. This experience would prove invaluable during his later commands, when his understanding of military administration would distinguish him from commanders who excelled at tactical brilliance but struggled with the mundane necessities of keeping armies fed, equipped, and motivated over extended campaigns. Caesar's election as quaestor in 69 BCE marked his formal entry into the Roman Senate and his assignment to serve in Farther Spain under the praetor Antistus Vetus. This position, while junior, provided him with crucial experience in provincial administration and access to the networks of Roman businessmen, local aristocrats, and military officers who actually managed the day-to-day operations of the empire. Spain in the 60s BCE was a province still recovering from the disruptions of the Sertorian War, a conflict that had devastated much of the region and left behind a legacy of political fragmentation and economic disruption. Caesar's duties as quaestor involved supervising tax collection, adjudicating legal disputes, and coordinating the complex logistics required to maintain Roman garrisons throughout a territory that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Pyrenees. Mountains tax collection in a roaming province was a complex operation that required detailed knowledge of local economic conditions, careful negotiation with regional leaders, and constant attention to the balance between extracting sufficient revenue to satisfy Roman requirements while avoiding the sort of excessive exploitation that might provoke rebellion. Caesar had to master the intricacies of currency exchange rates, agricultural production cycles, and commercial trade patterns that connected Spanish communities to markets throughout the Mediterranean world. More challenging still was the administration of justice in communities where Roman law had to be adapted to local customs and traditions. Caesar regularly found himself adjudicating disputes between Roman merchants and Spanish businessmen, resolving conflicts between different tribal groups, and interpreting Roman legal precedents and situations for which they had never been specifically designed. These experiences taught him valuable lessons about the flexibility required for effective governance and the importance of understanding local conditions when implementing imperial policies. His Spanish service also provided Caesar with his first experience in military command, as quaestors were responsible for organizing and leading the auxiliary forces that supported Roman legions. Caesar learned how to recruit soldiers from local populations, how to train irregulars to work effectively with professional legionaries, and how to coordinate complex military operations across difficult terrain. More importantly, he developed relationships with Spanish tribal leaders and Roman military officers that would prove valuable throughout his career. Caesar's return to Rome in 68 BCE was marked by personal tragedy, the death of his wife Cornelia, but also by political opportunity, as his successful service in Spain had enhanced his reputation and expanded his network of supporters. His marriage to Pompey, granddaughter of Sulla, represented a calculated attempt to balance his earlier association with the Marian faction by creating ties to more conservative elements within the Roman aristocracy. This marriage was, like most aristocratic Roman unions, primarily a political alliance, but it also reflected Caesar's growing understanding of how power actually worked in Roman society. Success required not just the support of one faction, but the ability to maintain relationships across factional boundaries, to be seen as someone who could work with different groups and navigate the complex web of personal loyalties and political obligations that connected Roman elites. Caesar's election as curule aedile in 65 BCE provided him with the opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of, quote, Roman voters actually wanted from their political leaders. The aedileship was responsible for organizing public games and maintaining public buildings. Duties that required not just administrative competence, but also a willingness to spend personal funds to provide spectacular entertainment for the Roman people. Caesar's games were notable not for their originality, but for their scale and attention to detail. He organized gladiatorial contests featuring 320 pairs of combatants, an unprecedented number that required months of planning and coordination with gladiatorial schools throughout Italy. He arranged wild beast hunts that featured exotic animals, imported from Africa and Asia, requiring complex logistical arrangements to transport, house and feed dangerous animals for extended periods. He supervised the construction of temporary theaters and amphitheaters, projects that required detailed engineering knowledge and careful coordination with building contractors. More significantly, Caesar used his aedileship to begin restoring monuments associated with Marius's victories, a politically sensitive project that required careful negotiation with conservative senators, while simultaneously demonstrating his loyalty to the Marian tradition. These restoration projects were not just symbolic gestures, but complex administrative undertakings that required research into historical records, coordination with craftsmen and artists, and navigation of the regulatory processes that governed public construction in Rome. The success of Caesar's aedileship was measured not just by the spectacular nature of his games, but by the administrative efficiency with which they were organized and the political skill with which he managed to satisfy different constituencies simultaneously. Conservative senators appreciated his attention to constitutional proprieties and his respect for traditional procedures. Popular assemblies were impressed by the scale and quality of his entertainment. Veterans and supporters of Marius were gratified by his restoration of their heroes' monuments. Yet, even as Caesar was achieving these early political successes, he was also accumulating the enormous debts that would drive much of his later career. The games and construction projects associated with his aedileship had cost far more than his official salary, requiring him to borrow extensively from Roman moneylenders and provincial businessmen. These debts were not simply personal obligations, but political investments that created networks of creditors who had financial interests in Caesar's continued advancement. Caesar's election as Pontifex Maximus in 63 BCE represented perhaps the most significant achievement of his early career. Not because of the religious duties involved, but because of the political maneuvering required to secure the position. The Pontifical College was responsible for maintaining Roman religious traditions, supervising the calendar and regulating the complex rituals that marked important public occasions. More practically, the Pontifex Maximus served as the chief interpreter of religious law, a position that provided significant influence over the conduct of public business. Caesar's campaign for this position required him to compete against two more senior and better-connected rivals, Quintus Lutatius Catullus and Publius Cerilius Fascia. His victory was achieved through a combination of political coalition building, financial expenditure, and tactical innovation that demonstrated his growing sophistication as a political operator. He secured support from tribunes and other popular politicians by promising to use the position to advance their legislative agenda. He won over tribal and provincial voters through personal appearances and carefully targeted spending. Most controversially, he allegedly resorted to bribery on a scale that shocked even contemporary Romans accustomed to electoral corruption. The morning of the election, Caesar reportedly told his mother that he would either return home as Pontifex Maximus or not return home at all, a statement that reflected not romantic fatalism, but a realistic assessment of the financial consequences of defeat. His debts were so extensive that failure to secure this position would have meant political and economic ruin, forcing him to flee Rome to avoid his creditors. His victory, achieved through margins that surprised contemporary observers, established him as a serious contender for higher office while simultaneously demonstrating his willingness to take enormous risks. When the potential rewards justified the dangers, Caesar's subsequent election as praetor for 62 BCE and his assignment to govern farther Spain provided him with the opportunity to address his financial difficulties while also gaining valuable experience in military command. Spain had been assigned to him precisely because it offered opportunities for profitable military campaigns against unconquered tribes, ventures that could provide both military glory and the sort of plunder that might resolve his debt crisis. Caesar's Spanish command was marked not by spectacular battles, but by the sort of systematic campaigning that gradually extended Roman control over previously independent territories. He organized multiple small-scale expeditions against tribal strongholds, carefully planned operations that combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiation to secure submission without requiring costly siege warfare. His campaigns were notable for their administrative efficiency, careful attention to supply lines, systematic intelligence gathering, and the sort of methodical approach to territorial conquest that would later characterize his Gallic Wars. More importantly, Caesar used his Spanish governorship to develop the administrative and logistical skills that distinguish him from other Roman commanders. He learned how to coordinate multiple columns advancing through difficult terrain, how to maintain communication across extended distances, how to adapt Roman military tactics to local conditions, and how to manage the complex politics of tribal societies where traditional leaders had to be co-opted or replaced while maintaining the loyalty of their followers. By the end of his Spanish service, Caesar had achieved his immediate objectives. He had eliminated his debts, established his reputation as an effective military commander, and demonstrated his ability to govern successfully in challenging circumstances. Yet he had also learned important lessons about the relationship between military success and political advancement in Roman society. Military glory was essential for career advancement, but it had to be combined with political skill, administrative competence, and the sort of attention to constituency maintenance that could sustain support during the inevitable periods between campaigns as Caesar prepared to return to Rome and launch his campaign for the consulship. He faced a strategic decision that would determine the trajectory of his entire career. He could seek triumph, elaborate ceremony that celebrated military victory and provided unparalleled opportunities for public recognition, or he could return immediately to Rome to campaign for consul. Roman law prohibited him from doing both, as candidates for office had to be present in the city during the campaign period, while triumph could only be celebrated by commanders who maintained their military imperium by remaining outside the city boundaries. Caesar chose immediate candidacy over ceremonial recognition, a decision that reflected his understanding that sustainable power in Roman society required not just military achievement, but also political office. Triumphs provided spectacular but temporary recognition. The consulship offered genuine authority and access to the networks of patronage and alliance that sustained long-term political careers. This choice also demonstrated Caesar's growing confidence in his political skills and his belief that he could achieve electoral success even without the publicity boost that triumph would have provided. Yet even as Caesar prepared for the consular campaign that would launch the final phase of his rise to power, significant questions remained about his ultimate objectives and his understanding of the challenges he would face. Roman politics rewarded ambition, but also punished those who appeared to seek power beyond the traditional boundaries of republican government. Success required not just the ability to win elections and command armies, but also the political skill to manage the suspicions and rivalries that inevitably surrounded any Roman who achieved exceptional prominence. How would Caesar navigate these challenges? How would he balance the competing demands of popular support and aristocratic acceptance? Military glory and political sustainability, personal ambition and constitutional propriety. The answers to these questions would emerge during his consulship and the extraordinary commands that followed. But they would be determined by the methodical preparation, careful relationship building, and administrative competence that had characterized his career thus far. For Caesar's greatest achievements would result not from dramatic inspiration or tactical brilliance, but from the patient, systematic application of the skills he had been developing throughout his deliberately tedious, carefully planned political apprenticeship. The consular election of 60 BCE represented the culmination of Caesar's methodical political apprenticeship and the beginning of his transformation from accomplished nulled senator to dominant political force. Yet the path to this achievement required navigating the most complex and tedious aspects of Roman electoral politics: the formation of political coalitions, the management of competing interests, and the sort of behind-the-scenes negotiation that rarely appeared in contemporary accounts, but which determined the actual distribution of power in the Roman Republic. Caesar's candidacy for the consulship was complicated by his immediate financial needs. The governorship of Spain had restored his solvency, but had not provided the massive wealth required to finance a consular campaign. By the determined opposition of conservative senators who viewed his combination of populist sympathies and military competence as potentially threatening to the established order. His solution was to engineer one of the most consequential political alliances in Roman history, but one that was achieved through months of private meetings, correspondence, and the sort of bureaucratic horse trading that historians often summarize in a few sentences, but which actually consumed enormous amounts of time and energy from all participants. The first triumvirate, as later historians would call it, was not a formal agreement, but rather a series of overlapping understandings between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, each of whom brought different resources and faced different political challenges. Pompey commanded enormous prestige from his military victories, but lacked the political skills to translate his popularity into legislative success. Crassus possessed vast wealth and extensive business connections, but was widely distrusted for his ambition and his associations with tax collectors and other unseemly commercial interests. Caesar offered political expertise and the potential for future military commands, but needed immediate financial support and protection from prosecution by his political enemies. The negotiations that produced their alliance required Caesar to spend countless hours in private meetings, drafting and redrafting agreements, mediating between personalities who disliked each other intensely, and developing compromise solutions to seemingly incompatible demands. Pompey wanted ratification of his eastern settlement and land grants for his veterans, measures that required legislative approval but faced determined opposition from conservative senators. Crassus sought tax relief for the publicani, who collected revenues in Asia, measure that would benefit his business associates, but which many senators viewed as corruption of the tax system. Caesar needed consular victory, debt relief, and assignment to a profitable province where he could rebuild his finances and establish military credentials comparable to those of his partners. The complexity of these negotiations was compounded by the need for absolute secrecy, as public revelation of the alliance would have provided Caesar's opponents with powerful ammunition for their electoral campaign. Every meeting required elaborate security arrangements. Communications had to be transmitted through trusted intermediaries. Financial arrangements had to be disguised as routine business transactions. The entire process demanded not just political acumen, but also the sort of administrative attention to detail that characterized successful intelligence operations. Caesar's electoral campaign itself was a masterpiece of organizational efficiency that combined traditional Roman political methods with innovative approaches to constituency mobilization. His campaign headquarters became the center of a complex operation that tracked the political preferences of individual voters, coordinated the activities of supporters throughout the city, and managed the flow of information and resources required to sustain electoral momentum over the months-long campaign period. The fundamental challenge of Roman electoral politics was that voting took place in the Campus Martis outside the city proper, where citizens were organized into electoral units, centuries, and tribes that reflected social status and geographic origin rather than simple numerical equality. Success required not just popular support, but also careful analysis of which specific electoral units could be influenced and how their votes could be most effectively secured. Caesar's campaign staff included specialists in electoral law who could predict the likely composition of the electorate on any given day, intelligence operatives who monitored the activities of rival campaigns, and financial managers who could coordinate the complex arrangements required to provide food, entertainment, and transportation for supporters. Traditional Roman electoral methods included personal canvassing, the candidate personally visiting potential supporters, public speaking at formal gatherings, and the provision of entertainment and refreshment for voters. Caesar excelled at all of these activities, but he also understood that electoral success in the Rome of the late Republic required more sophisticated approaches to voter mobilization. His campaign developed systematic methods for identifying and tracking potential supporters, created organizational structures that could coordinate activities across different regions of the city, and established communication networks that could rapidly disseminate information or respond to developments in rival campaigns. The financial aspects of Caesar's campaign were managed with particular care, as Roman electoral law included provisions against bribery that were regularly evoked by unsuccessful candidates seeking to overturn unfavorable results. Caesar's campaign expenses had to be documented, justified, and prepared for potential legal scrutiny while simultaneously providing the resources necessary for electoral victory. This required sophisticated accounting procedures, careful coordination between official campaign expenditures and private political investments, and the sort of legal preparation that anticipated challenges and prepared defensive strategies. Caesar's electoral platform combined traditional conservative themes with carefully targeted appeals to specific constituencies whose support could prove decisive. He promised respect for constitutional traditions and senatorial prerogatives, themes designed to reassure conservative voters who might otherwise have supported his opponents. He advocated for land redistribution and debt relief measures that would benefit urban plebs and rural veterans who formed crucial electoral constituencies. He supported provincial reforms and commercial regulations that would appeal to business interests without alienating traditional landed aristocracy. More significantly, Caesar demonstrated throughout his campaign the sort of administrative competence and attention to procedural detail that distinguished effective governors from mere demagogues. His policy proposals included detailed implementation plans, realistic financial projections, and the sort of bureaucratic preparation that suggested he understood how to translate campaign promises into actual governmental action. His campaign organization itself served as evidence of his administrative capabilities, as its efficiency and coordination impressed even political opponents who disagreed with his policy positions. Caesar's electoral victory in the summer of 60 BCE was decisive but not overwhelming, reflecting both the effectiveness of his campaign organization and the strength of conservative opposition to his candidacy. His colleague as consul was Marcus Bibulus, respected conservative whose election represented a deliberate attempt by Caesar's opponents to constrain his activities through institutional checks and balances. The stage was set for a confrontation between populist ambition and conservative resistance that would determine not just the success of Caesar's specific legislative agenda, but also the broader question of whether Roman institutions could accommodate the sort of systematic political innovation that Caesar represented. Caesar's approach to the consulship demonstrated his understanding that effectiveness in Roman government required not just constitutional authority, but also the political skill to build coalitions, manage opposition, and navigate the complex procedural requirements that governed legislative action. His first major initiative, a land redistribution bill designed to benefit Pompey's veterans and address the broader problem of urban unemployment, was carefully crafted to anticipate conservative objections while providing sufficient benefits to key constituencies to ensure popular support. The bill itself was a masterpiece of legislative drafting that addressed multiple political objectives simultaneously while remaining technically compatible with Roman constitutional principles. It provided land grants for veterans of Pompey's Eastern campaigns, thereby satisfying one of the triumvirate's key commitments. It included provisions for purchasing land at fair market value rather than simply confiscating private property, thereby addressing conservative concerns about property rights. It established administrative procedures for implementing the program that were designed to minimize corruption while ensuring efficient execution. Yet the bill also included innovative provisions that expanded the traditional scope of Roman land legislation. It authorized the use of revenue from Pompey's eastern conquests to finance land purchases, thereby creating a precedent for using military profits to fund domestic social programs. It established new administrative institutions with broad authority to oversee the redistribution process, thereby creating governmental structures that could serve as models for future policy innovations. It included mechanisms for ongoing oversight and evaluation that would ensure the program's effectiveness while protecting it from political interference. The opposition to Caesar's land bill was organized by Cato the Younger and other conservative senators who recognized that its passage would establish precedents for popular legislation that could undermine traditional senatorial authority. Their resistance took the form of procedural obstruction, constitutional challenges, and the sort of systematic political warfare that could paralyze governmental function for extended periods. Cato, in particular, was willing to filibuster indefinitely to prevent votes on legislation he considered dangerous, forcing Caesar to develop innovative procedural strategies to circumvent traditional obstacles. Caesar's response to this opposition demonstrated both his understanding of Roman constitutional law and his willingness to stretch traditional procedures when necessary to achieve political objectives. When Cato's filibustering prevented normal legislative proceedings, Caesar arranged for his physical removal from the Senate chamber, a dramatic gesture that was technically legal but violated traditional norms of senatorial courtesy. When conservative senators attempted to invalidate his legislation through religious objections, Caesar secured favorable omens from compliant priests and dismissed opposing interpretations as politically motivated. Most significantly, Caesar bypassed senatorial opposition entirely by taking his legislation directly to the popular assemblies, where his triumvirate connections could ensure favorable votes regardless of elite opinion. This strategy was constitutionally permissible but politically revolutionary, as it established the principle that popular support could override senatorial resistance even on complex policy matters that traditionally required extensive elite deliberation. The successful passage of Caesar's land legislation marked a fundamental shift in Roman political practice, but it also created the administrative challenges that would occupy much of his remaining consular term. Implementation of the land redistribution program required the creation of new governmental institutions, the recruitment and training of administrative personnel, the development of procedures for evaluating and purchasing land, and the coordination of complex logistical operations that would relocate thousands of families throughout Italy. Caesar approached these administrative challenges with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his earlier career. He personally supervised the selection of commissioners responsible for implementing the program, ensuring that appointees possessed both the technical expertise and political reliability necessary for success. He established procedures for appeals and oversight that would protect the program from corruption while maintaining public confidence in its fairness. He coordinated with local officials throughout Italy to ensure smooth implementation while minimizing disruption to existing communities. The administrative apparatus created to implement. Caesar's land legislation became a model for future Roman social programs and demonstrated his understanding that lasting political change required not just legislative victory, but also effective implementation. The success of the land redistribution program provided concrete benefits to thousands of Roman families while simultaneously establishing Caesar's reputation as a leader who could translate political promises into practical results. Caesar's other major legislative achievements during his consulship followed similar patterns of careful preparation, innovative policy design, and meticulous implementation. His ratification of Pompey's eastern settlement required him to master the complex details of provincial administration, diplomatic agreements, and financial arrangements that governed Rome's relationships with dozens of client kingdoms and tributary states. His tax relief for the publicani demanded sophisticated understanding of revenue collection, commercial law, and the sort of financial engineering that could provide benefits to business interests without compromising essential governmental functions. Perhaps most significantly, Caesar used his consulship to establish the administrative and political foundations for his subsequent extraordinary commands. His legislative program created precedents for popular legislation that would facilitate future political innovation. His successful implementation of complex policy initiatives demonstrated his administrative competence to potential supporters and opponents alike. His coordination with Pompey and Crassus established patterns of cooperation that would sustain their alliance through future challenges. Yet, Caesar's consular year also revealed the limitations of reform within traditional republican institutions, and the growing polarization that would eventually destroy the Roman constitutional system. His conflicts with conservative opposition had required increasingly dramatic departures from traditional procedures. His reliance on popular assemblies had undermined the Senate's traditional role in policy deliberation. His partnership with Pompey and Crassus had created an informal concentration of power that many Romans viewed as incompatible with republican principles. As Caesar's consular term drew to its close, the question of his future commands became the central issue in Roman politics. The triumvirate had promised him assignment to profitable provinces where he could rebuild his finances and establish military credentials. But conservative opposition threatened to assign him to ceremonial posts that would provide neither financial rewards nor opportunities for military glory. The resolution of this conflict would require the sort of political maneuvering that had characterized Caesar's entire career. But it would also determine whether his consulship represented the climax of a successful political career or merely the foundation for even greater achievements. The answer came in the form of the Lex Vitinia, a tribunician law that granted Caesar unprecedented authority over Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum for 5 years, with the addition of Transalpine Gaul, following the death of its assigned governor. This command would provide Caesar with the military opportunities he needed to establish his reputation as a general, while also offering the financial resources required to sustain his political career. More importantly, it would give him access to the legions and territorial base that would eventually enable him to challenge the Roman Republic itself. Yet, as Caesar departed Rome to take up his Gallic command, he carried with him not just the authority granted by law, but also the political skills, administrative experience, and strategic understanding that he had developed through 2 decades of patient career advancement. His success in Gaul would depend not just on tactical brilliance or strategic vision, but on the sort of methodical preparation, careful organization, and attention to bureaucratic detail that had characterized his entire political apprenticeship. For Caesar's greatest military achievements would emerge not from dramatic inspiration, but from the systematic application of the administrative and political skills he had been developing throughout his deliberately tedious, carefully planned rise to power. When Caesar departed Rome in the spring of 58 BCE to assume his command in Gaul, He carried with him not just the formal authority of a Roman magistrate, but also 20 years of experience in the administrative complexities that actually determined the success or failure of Roman military campaigns. His proconsular imperium granted him theoretical control over Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum territories that collectively encompassed much of what we now call northern Italy, southern France, and the Western Balkans. But transforming that legal authority into effective control would require mastering logistical challenges that were far more complex and demanding than any battlefield tactics. The sheer scale of Caesar's territorial responsibility was unprecedented. For a Roman commander, his provinces contained dozens of tribal groups, hundreds of fortified settlements, and millions of people who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and maintained complex networks of alliance and rivalry that Roman administrators had only begun to understand. Success would require not just military victory, but also the sort of systematic intelligence gathering, diplomatic coordination, and administrative innovation that could transform a collection of independent territories into a functioning imperial province. Caesar's first priority was establishing the administrative infrastructure required to support sustained military operations. Roman armies were not self-contained units that could operate independently for extended periods, but rather complex logistical systems that required constant resupply, regular communication with political authorities, and careful coordination with civilian administrators who managed taxation, recruitment, and the provision of local intelligence. Creating this infrastructure in territories where Roman authority was still contested required months of patient, organizational work that rarely appeared in dramatic, historical accounts but which determined the success or failure of entire campaigns. The logistical requirements of Roman military operations were staggering in their complexity and scale. A single legion of approximately 5,000 men required roughly 2,000 tons of grain annually, plus comparable quantities of other foodstuffs, equipment, weapons, and supplies. Caesar's eventual command of 8 to 10 legions meant that his armies consumed between 16,000 and 20,000 tons of grain each year, plus proportional quantities of meat, wine, oil, salt, and other necessities. Providing these supplies in territories where Roman control was incomplete required establishing networks of suppliers, negotiating agreements with local producers, and creating transportation systems that could move enormous quantities of material across hundreds of miles of often hostile territory. Caesar's approach to these challenges reflected his understanding that military success depended as much on administrative competence as on tactical skill. He spent his first months in Gaul not planning dramatic campaigns, but rather establishing the bureaucratic foundations that would support his subsequent operations. He recruited and trained administrative personnel who could manage supply contracts, maintain financial records, and coordinate with local officials throughout his provinces. He negotiated agreements with tribal leaders who could provide intelligence, supplies, and auxiliary forces. He established communication networks that could rapidly transmit information across his vast territorial command. The recruitment and organization of Caesar's legions required particularly careful attention to administrative detail. As Roman law included specific provisions governing military service that had to be observed even during emergency mobilizations. Citizens could not be compelled to serve beyond their legal obligations without adequate compensation. Veterans could not be retained beyond their terms of enlistment without additional inducements. Auxiliary forces raised from provincial populations had to be integrated into Roman military structures while maintaining their tribal identities and command arrangements. Caesar's success in managing these challenges reflected his understanding that Roman military power depended not just on professional legions, but also on the complex networks of alliance and obligation that connected Rome to populations throughout the Mediterranean world. His armies included not only Roman citizens serving their required military obligations, but also volunteers seeking advancement, veterans recalled to service for specific campaigns, auxiliary forces provided by allied tribal groups seeking to benefit from association with Roman power. The integration of these diverse military components required sophisticated administrative procedures that could maintain unit cohesion while accommodating different languages, customs, and military traditions. Caesar's staff included interpreters, liaisons with tribal leaders, specialists in local geography and military practices, and administrative personnel who could manage the complex arrangements required to feed, equip, and coordinate multinational military forces. This administrative apparatus became increasingly sophisticated as Caesar's campaigns expanded and the diversity of his forces increased. Caesar's first military challenge came not from a planned campaign of conquest, but from the migration of the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe seeking to relocate from what is now Switzerland to territories in western Gaul. This movement involved approximately 370,000 people, including women, children, and elderly, traveling with all their possessions in a massive wagon train that stretched for dozens of miles. The Helvetii requested passage through Roman territory, a reasonable request that nonetheless presented Caesar with complex political and strategic challenges. From a purely legal perspective, the Helvetii migration posed no direct threat to Roman interests, as the tribe had no hostile intentions toward Rome and sought only to transit Roman territory en route to their intended destination. However, Caesar recognized that allowing such a massive population movement could destabilize the entire region by displacing other tribal groups, disrupting trade networks, and creating opportunities for anti-Roman coalitions. More immediately, the precedent of allowing large tribal migrations could encourage similar movements that might prove more directly threatening to Roman security. Caesar's response to the Helvetii migration demonstrated his understanding that effective governance required not just reaction to immediate threats, but also consideration of long-term strategic implications. His refusal to grant transit rights was based not on immediate necessity, but on his assessment that preventing the migration would enhance Roman security while providing opportunities to demonstrate Roman power to other tribal groups who were evaluating their relationships with the expanding republic. The military campaign against the Helvetii required Caesar to coordinate multiple columns, advancing through difficult terrain while maintaining supply lines that extended back to Roman territory. His armies had to carry sufficient provisions for extended operations while remaining mobile enough to pursue a migrating population that was not constrained by fixed defensive positions. The logistical challenges were compounded by the need to prevent the Helvetii from dispersing into smaller groups that could evade Roman forces while continuing their westward movement. Caesar's victory at the Battle of Bibracte on June 20, 58 BCE, was achieved through the sort of methodical preparation and tactical coordination that characterized Roman military professionalism, rather than through dramatic individual heroism or brilliant strategic inspiration. His legions advanced in carefully coordinated formations that maintained mutual support while adapting to local terrain conditions. His auxiliary forces provided reconnaissance and protected supply lines, while his main battle formations engaged the Helvetii warriors. His cavalry prevented enemy escape, while his engineers constructed the fortifications that would contain captured populations. The aftermath of the battle required even more extensive administrative work than the campaign itself. Caesar had to process approximately 110,000 prisoners, organize their return to their original territories, establish the agreements and arrangements that would prevent future migrations. This involved negotiating with dozens of tribal leaders, arranging for the provision of food and transportation for displaced populations, and creating administrative structures that could monitor compliance with Roman requirements. More significantly, Caesar used the Helvetii campaign to establish patterns of relationship with Gallic tribal groups that would facilitate his subsequent campaigns. He demonstrated Roman military superiority while offering reasonable terms to populations that submitted voluntarily. He established precedents for treating conquered peoples that balanced Roman security requirements with respect for local customs and leadership structures. He created administrative procedures for managing tribal auxiliaries that would prove essential for his later operations. The success of Caesar's first campaign attracted delegations from other Gallic tribes seeking Roman assistance against their own enemies. Requests that provided Caesar with opportunities for further military operations while advancing Roman strategic interests. The most significant of these was the request from the Sequani and other tribes for assistance against Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had established himself in eastern Izoka and was threatening to extend his influence throughout the region. Represented a different type of challenge than the Helvetii, as he commanded a sophisticated military organization and had established diplomatic relationships with various Gallic tribes. His forces included not only Germanic warriors, but also Gallic allies who provided local knowledge and auxiliary forces. His territorial base in eastern Gaul gave him access to resources and strategic positions that could support extended military campaigns against Roman forces. Caesar's campaign against Ariovistus required different administrative and logistical arrangements than his operations against the Helvetii, as he was now conducting offensive operations in territories where Roman control was limited and local support was uncertain. His supply lines had to be secured against harassment by Germanic raiders. His intelligence networks had to be expanded to provide information about enemy movements and capabilities. His diplomatic efforts had to balance support from some Gallic tribes with the need to prevent others from joining Germanic coalitions. The military confrontation with Ariovistus culminated in a pitched battle near modern Vesontio, where Caesar's legions achieved victory through the sort of tactical coordination and professional discipline that distinguished Roman armies from tribal forces. However, the significance of this victory extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, as it established Roman dominance in eastern Gaul while demonstrating to tribal leaders throughout the region that Germanic military superiority was not inevitable. Caesar's administrative handling of his victory over Ariovistus reflected his growing understanding of the complexities of imperial governance. Rather than simply expelling Germanic populations from Gaul, he negotiated agreements that established clear territorial boundaries, while providing mechanisms for peaceful interaction between different ethnic groups. Rather than imposing direct Roman administration over conquered territories, he worked through existing tribal structures while gradually introducing Roman legal and administrative procedures. The success of Caesar's first year in Gaul was measured not just by his military victories, but also by his establishment of administrative systems that could sustain Roman control over vast territories with minimal ongoing military presence. His networks of tribal allies provided intelligence and auxiliary forces for future campaigns. His logistical arrangements could support extended military operations while maintaining regular communication with Rome. His diplomatic relationships created stability that encouraged trade and economic development throughout the region. Yet, Caesar's administrative achievements also created new challenges and opportunities that would drive his subsequent campaigns. His success in southern and eastern Gaul had attracted the attention of tribal groups throughout the region, some seeking Roman protection and others organizing resistance to Roman expansion. His military reputation had enhanced his political position in Rome, but had also increased expectations for continued success that could only be satisfied through additional conquests. Most significantly, Caesar's first year in Gaul had demonstrated that systematic conquest of the entire region was both militarily feasible and politically advantageous. The wealth generated by his campaigns could support larger armies and more ambitious operations. The tribal auxiliaries recruited through his diplomatic efforts could supplement Roman legions and provide local expertise for campaigns in unfamiliar territories. The administrative experience gained through governing conquered populations could be applied to managing even larger and more diverse imperial provinces. As Caesar prepared for his second year in Gaul, he faced strategic decisions that would determine the scope and character of his subsequent campaigns. He could consolidate his existing conquests and focus on developing effective administrative systems for governing the territories already under Roman control. Alternatively, he could expand his operations to include additional regions whose conquest would provide greater military glory, political advancement, and financial rewards. The answer to these questions would be determined not by dramatic strategic inspiration, but by the same sort of methodical analysis of costs, benefits, and practical possibilities that had guided Caesar's approach to every previous challenge in his career. His decision to expand operations into northern Gaul, across the Rhine, into Germania, and even across the Channel into Britain would emerge from careful calculation of political necessity, military opportunity, and administrative feasibility, rather than from sudden ambition or tactical inspiration. Yet, as Caesar contemplated these possibilities, he also understood that success would continue to depend on the same administrative competence, logistical preparation, and bureaucratic attention to detail that had characterized his first year's achievements. For the conquest of Gaul would ultimately be determined not by individual battles or dramatic moments of decision, but by the patient, systematic application of Roman organizational superiority to the challenges of imperial expansion. Caesar's second year in Gaul brought challenges that required him to expand his administrative systems beyond the relatively straightforward tribal conflicts of his initial campaigns. The formation of the Belgic Confederation represented a new level of organizational sophistication among his opponents. As dozens of tribal groups coordinated their military efforts and resources in ways that demanded correspondingly complex Roman responses, managing campaigns against such coalitions required Caesar to develop intelligence networks, logistical systems, and diplomatic strategies that could operate simultaneously across multiple theaters while maintaining the sort of detailed coordination that his earlier successes had demonstrated was essential for sustained military effectiveness. The Belgic tribes presented particularly complex challenges for Roman administrative systems because their territories extended across what are now Belgium, northern France, and parts of the Netherlands and Germany regions where Roman geographical knowledge was limited and existing trade networks provided inadequate foundations for military supply lines. Caesar's preliminary intelligence indicated that the Confederation could field approximately 300,000 warriors, a figure that, even allowing for the customary exaggerations of ancient military estimates, suggested that he would face opponents whose numerical strength far exceeded anything he had previously encountered. Caesar's response to this challenge demonstrated his understanding that successful military operations required extensive preliminary work that was far more time-consuming and administratively complex than the actual fighting. His first priority was expanding his intelligence networks to provide detailed information about Belgic military capabilities, political structures, and territorial arrangements. This required recruiting and training agents who could travel throughout Belgic territories, establishing communication networks that could rapidly transmit information across hundreds of miles, and developing analytical procedures that could convert raw intelligence into actionable strategic assessments. The recruitment of intelligence agents presented particular challenges in regions where Roman political influence was limited and local. Populations were increasingly suspicious of Roman intentions. Caesar had to identify individuals who possessed both the local knowledge and political access required for effective intelligence gathering, while also ensuring their reliability and protecting them from detection by hostile tribal leaders. This required establishing networks of safe houses, communication procedures, and financial arrangements that could support extended intelligence operations without compromising operational security. Caesar's logistical preparations for the Belgic campaigns required even more extensive administrative innovation, as he had to supply multiple legions operating across broader territories for longer periods than his previous campaigns had required. His supply networks had to accommodate not just Roman legions, but also increasing numbers of auxiliary forces recruited from allied tribal groups, each with their own dietary preferences, equipment requirements, and logistical traditions. The complexity of these arrangements was compounded by the need to maintain operational flexibility while ensuring that all units remained adequately supplied regardless of tactical developments. The procurement of supplies for Caesars expanded. Operations required sophisticated financial arrangements that could coordinate resources from throughout Roman territory while accommodating the limited commercial infrastructure of Gallic regions. Caesar's administrators negotiated contracts with suppliers in northern Italy, southern France, and coastal regions of Gaul, establishing transportation networks that could move enormous quantities of grain, wine, oil, salt, and manufactured goods across hundreds of miles of often difficult terrain. These arrangements required detailed planning, careful coordination, and constant monitoring to ensure that supplies reached their intended destinations when and where they were needed. Caesar's approach to the Belgic Confederation reflected his understanding that military success against large coalitions required not just tactical superiority, but also strategic approaches that could exploit political divisions and prevent effective enemy coordination. Rather than attempting to defeat the entire confederation in a single decisive battle, Caesar developed campaigns that were designed to separate different tribal groups, to neutralize the most dangerous opponents, and encourage defections that would gradually weaken enemy capabilities. The Siege of Bibrax, one of the first major engagements of the Belgic campaign, illustrated the administrative challenges that accompanied even seemingly straightforward military operations. The town was defended by Remi warriors who were allied with Rome, but it was besieged by a Belgic army that outnumbered the defenders by perhaps 10 to 1. Caesar's relief operation required coordinating the movements of multiple legions across difficult terrain while maintaining supply lines and communication networks that could support both the advancing Roman forces and the besieged garrison. The logistics of siege warfare were particularly demanding, as they required Roman forces to maintain fixed positions for extended periods while consuming enormous quantities of supplies and equipment. Caesar's engineers had to construct siege works, roads, bridges, and fortifications that could support major military operations, while his administrators had to organize the transportation of heavy equipment, siege engines, and the specialized materials required for sustained siege operations. The successful relief of Bibrax required weeks of preparation and coordination that involved thousands of personnel in various support roles. Caesar's victory over the Belgic Confederation at the Battle of the Sabes River demonstrated both the effectiveness of Roman military professionalism and the administrative systems that made such professionalism possible. The battle began as a near disaster for Roman forces, as Belgic warriors achieved tactical surprise and nearly overwhelmed Caesar's legions before they could deploy in their customary formations. Recovery from this initial setback required not just tactical flexibility and command leadership, but also the sort of systematic training, unit cohesion, and logistical preparation that enabled Roman forces to reorganize under pressure and launch successful counterattacks. The administrative aftermath of the Sabes victory required Caesar to process tens of thousands of prisoners, negotiate surrender terms with dozens of tribal leaders, and establish the governmental structures that would maintain Roman control over newly conquered territories. This involved creating administrative positions for managing tribal affairs, establishing procedures for tax collection and legal administration, and developing communication networks that could maintain contact between scattered Roman garrisons and provincial headquarters. More significantly, Caesar's Belgic campaigns established administrative precedents and procedures that would be applied throughout his subsequent Gallic operations. His intelligence networks provided models for gathering information in unfamiliar territories. His logistical systems demonstrated methods for supplying large armies operating far from established Roman bases. His diplomatic procedures established patterns for negotiating with tribal leaders, processing surrenders, and managing the complex political arrangements required to maintain control over conquered populations. The success of Caesar's Belgic campaigns also provided him with resources and opportunities that would facilitate his subsequent military adventures. The wealth captured during these operations enabled him to expand his armies and extend his logistical networks. The auxiliary forces recruited from conquered tribes provided local expertise and additional military capability for future campaigns. The territorial control established in northern Gaul provided secure bases for operations in even more distant regions. Caesar's decision to expand his operations beyond continental Gaul reflected his understanding that sustained political advancement in Rome required not just military success, but also achievements that captured public imagination and demonstrated Roman superiority over foreign peoples. His expeditions across the Rhine into Germania and across the English Channel into Britain were as much political theater as military strategy. But they also required the sort of administrative innovation and logistical coordination that had characterized his earlier campaigns. The construction of Caesar's bridge across the Rhine represented one of the most remarkable engineering and administrative achievements of ancient warfare. The project required not just technical expertise in bridge construction, but also complex logistical arrangements for transporting materials, tools, and specialized personnel to a remote location where Roman supply networks were limited. Caesar's engineers had to design structures that could support the passage of entire legions, while remaining defensible against potential Germanic attacks. The administrative challenges of the Rhine bridge project included recruiting skilled craftsmen from throughout Roman territory, organizing the transportation of heavy timber and construction materials across hundreds of miles, and coordinating the activities of thousands of workers while maintaining operational security in hostile territory. The project was completed in just 10 days, a timeline that reflected not just engineering expertise, but also the sophisticated administrative and logistical systems that Caesar had developed throughout his Gallic campaigns. Caesar's Germanic expedition itself lasted only 18 days, but it required months of preliminary preparation and administrative coordination. His intelligence networks had to provide information about Germanic tribal structures, military capabilities, and political arrangements. His logistical systems had to supply an entire army operating in territories where Roman control was non-existent and local cooperation was uncertain. His diplomatic efforts had to balance demonstrations of Roman power with the need to avoid precipitating unnecessary conflicts that could complicate his withdrawal. The limited duration and scope of Caesar's Germanic operations reflected his realistic assessment of the administrative and strategic challenges that conquest of Germania would entail. Unlike Gaul, where Roman commercial and political influence provided foundations for military operations, Germania remained largely outside Roman networks of trade and diplomacy. Sustained operations in Germania would have required administrative innovations and resource commitments that exceeded even Caesar's considerable capabilities, while offering uncertain political and economic benefits. Caesar's British expeditions represented similar combinations of political theater and administrative challenge, as they required him to develop entirely new logistical capabilities for amphibious operations while demonstrating Roman power to audiences both in Britain and Rome. The construction of specialized transport ships, the training of personnel in amphibious warfare, and the development of supply systems that could operate across the English Channel all required months of preparation and enormous expenditures of resources. The first British expedition in 55 BCE was necessarily limited in scope and duration, as Caesar lacked the intelligence and logistical infrastructure required for sustained operations in unfamiliar territory. His forces landed, engaged local opponents, and withdrew after demonstrating Roman capability to project power across natural barriers that had previously protected British tribes from continental interference. The expedition's primary value was political rather than strategic, as it enhanced Caesar's reputation in Rome while providing intelligence that would facilitate future operations. Caesar's second British expedition in 54 BCE was far more substantial, involving 5 legions and extensive auxiliary forces that required unprecedented logistical coordination. The administrative challenges included constructing a fleet of transport ships designed specifically for British operations, organizing supplies for extended campaigns in territories where Roman logistics networks were non-existent, and coordinating amphibious landings that required precise timing and coordination between naval and military forces. The success of Caesar's British operations demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman administrative and logistical systems, while also revealing their limitations when applied to territories beyond the reach of established imperial infrastructure. Caesar's forces achieved their immediate military objectives and extracted tribute from British tribal leaders. But sustaining Roman control over Britain would have required permanent garrisons and administrative structures that exceeded the resources available for Gallic operations. Caesar's British expeditions also illustrated the relationship between military achievement and political advancement that drove much of his Gallic strategy. The expeditions provided spectacular demonstrations of Roman power that enhanced Caesar's reputation throughout the Mediterranean world, while also providing concrete benefits in the form of tribute, hostages, and intelligence about British resources and political structures. Yet they also required enormous expenditures of resources and exposed his forces to risks that were justified primarily by political rather than strategic considerations. The administrative systems that Caesar developed to support his British operations became models for subsequent Roma amphibious warfare and demonstrated the flexibility and innovation that characterized Roman military organization. His naval construction programs, amphibious training procedures, and cross-channel supply networks established precedents that would be applied during later Roman operations in Britain and other maritime theaters. As Caesar concluded his British expeditions and prepared to consolidate his Gallic conquests, he faced strategic and administrative challenges that would determine both the success of his provincial governance and his future political prospects in Rome. His military victories had established Roman control over vast territories, but converting the control into stable provincial administration required different skills and approaches than those that had achieved battlefield success. The wealth and glory that Caesar had achieved through his Gallic campaigns had enhanced his political position in Rome. But they had also increased expectations for continued success and attracted the attention of rivals who viewed his achievements as threats to their own ambitions. Managing these political challenges while simultaneously governing his provinces required the same sort of systematic attention to detail and administrative competence that characterized his military operations. How would Caesar balance the competing demands of provincial governance and Roman politics? How would he maintain control over his Gallic territories while preparing for the political challenges that awaited his return to Rome? The answers to these questions would emerge from the same methodical approach to strategic planning and administrative management that had distinguished his entire Gallic career. But they would be tested by challenges that exceeded anything he had previously encountered by the winter of 54 BCE. Caesar had transformed the nature of his Gallic command from a series of reactive military campaigns into a comprehensive exercise in imperial administration that required managing the complex relationships between Roman authority and local populations across territories that encompassed most of modern France, Belgium, parts of Germany, and portions of Britain. The sheer scale of this administrative challenge was unprecedented in Roman history, as no previous commander had been required to establish governmental structures for such diverse populations across such extensive territories, while simultaneously maintaining the military capabilities required to suppress persistent resistance. Caesar's approach to provincial administration in Gaul reflected his understanding that sustainable Roman control required not just military dominance, but also administrative systems that could accommodate local customs and leadership structures, while gradually introducing Roman legal and commercial practices. This required developing hybrid governmental arrangements that balanced Roman strategic requirements with tribal political traditions, creating administrative procedures that could function effectively in societies where literacy was limited and Roman law was unfamiliar, and establishing economic relationships that would benefit both Roman interests and local populations. The complexity of Caesar's administrative responsibilities was compounded by the diversity of the populations under his authority. His provinces included Celtic tribes with sophisticated political structures and commercial networks, Germanic groups with warrior-based social organizations, coastal peoples whose economies depended on maritime trade, mountain communities that relied primarily on pastoral agriculture, and urbanized populations in regions with established commercial centers. Each of these groups required different administrative approaches, while all had to be integrated into coherent provincial structures that could function effectively within the broader framework of Roman imperial governance. Caesar's administrative innovations in Gaul included the development of new procedures for managing tribal auxiliaries, the creation of hybrid legal systems that combined Roman and local practices, and the establishment of communication networks that could coordinate governmental activities across vast territories. His staff included not just Roman administrators and military officers, but also tribal leaders who served as intermediaries, interpreters who facilitated communication between different linguistic groups, and technical specialists who could adapt Roman administrative practices to local conditions. The integration of tribal auxiliaries into Roman military structures required particularly sophisticated administrative procedures, as Caesar had to maintain the effectiveness of Roman tactical systems while accommodating the military traditions and social structures of diverse tribal groups. Auxiliary units had to be equipped, trained, and commanded in ways that preserved their distinctive capabilities while ensuring their compatibility with Roman legions. This required developing new command structures, logistical procedures, and training programs that could manage multinational military forces effectively. Caesar's legal innovations in Gaul established precedents for provincial administration throughout the Roman Empire, as he developed procedures for applying Roman law to populations that were unfamiliar with Roman legal traditions while respecting local customs and practices that did not conflict with Roman strategic requirements. His judicial decisions created case law that would guide subsequent provincial governors, while his administrative procedures established models for managing the complex relationships between imperial authority and local governance. The financial administration of Caesar's Gallic provinces required developing new procedures for taxation, trade regulation, and currency management that could accommodate the diverse economic systems that existed throughout his territories. Caesar's administrators had to establish tax assessment procedures that could function in societies where wealth was measured differently than in Roman communities, develop trade regulations that could facilitate commerce while protecting Roman commercial interests, and create currency systems that could serve both Roman and local economic needs. Caesar's approach to economic development in Gaul demonstrated his understanding that sustainable imperial control required not just political submission, but also economic integration that would benefit both Roman interests and local populations. His policies encouraged the development of commercial relationships between Gallic producers and Roman markets, facilitated the introduction of Roman agricultural and manufacturing techniques, and promoted the establishment of urban centers that could serve as focal points for regional economic development. The administrative challenges of governing Gaul were significantly complicated by the persistent resistance that Caesar encountered throughout his command. Resistance that required him to maintain extensive military forces while simultaneously developing civilian governmental structures. The most serious of these challenges emerged during the winter of 54 to 53 BCE, when coordinated rebellions threatened to destroy the administrative systems that Caesar had spent years developing. The Eburones rebellion, led by Ambiorix, demonstrated both the vulnerabilities of Roman administrative systems and the innovations that Caesar had developed to address such challenges. The rebellion began with an attack on Roman winter quarters that resulted in the destruction of 2 legions and the deaths of their commanders, Sabinus and Cotta. This disaster was not just a military setback, but also an administrative crisis that threatened to undermine Roman authority throughout the region and potentially inspire additional rebellions. Caesar's response to the Eburones rebellion required coordinating military operations with administrative measures designed to maintain the loyalty of allied tribes while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to Roman authority. His campaigns against Ambiorix involved not just military pursuit, but also systematic destruction of economic infrastructure, population relocation, and the sort of administrative measures designed to prevent future rebellions while maintaining the governmental systems required for continued Roman control. The relief of Quintus. Cicero's besieged camp during the winter uprising required Caesar to coordinate rapid military response with the administrative systems that had been established. To support Roman garrisons throughout Gaul, the successful relief operation demonstrated the effectiveness of Caesar's communication networks, supply systems, and coordination procedures, while also revealing the administrative challenges that accompanied military operations in hostile territory during winter months when normal supply arrangements were disrupted. Caesar's administrative response to the winter rebellions included systematic reforms designed to prevent similar challenges in the future. He reorganized garrison assignments to reduce vulnerabilities, established improved intelligence networks that could provide earlier warning of potential uprisings, and developed administrative procedures that could maintain Roman authority with smaller military forces. These innovations would prove essential for his ability to maintain control over Gaul while pursuing additional military operations. The most significant administrative challenge of Caesar's Gallic command emerged in 52 BCE with the formation of the Grand Coalition led by Vercingetorix, a rebellion that threatened not just Roman military positions, but also the entire administrative and economic infrastructure that Caesar had developed throughout his provinces. Vercingetorix's strategy of coordinated resistance, economic warfare, and systematic destruction of resources represented a sophisticated understanding of Roman administrative vulnerabilities and required correspondingly innovative Roman responses. Vercingetorix's coalition represented the most serious administrative challenge that Caesar had faced in Gaul because it combined military resistance with systematic attempts to destroy the economic and political relationships that sustained Roman authority. The coalition's strategy of destroying food supplies, evacuating populations, and eliminating local leaders who had cooperated with Rome was designed to force Roman withdrawal by making continued occupation economically and administratively impossible. Caesar's response to Vercingetorix's rebellion required him to adapt his administrative systems to support military operations under conditions where normal supply networks had been disrupted, and local cooperation could no longer be assumed. His logistical arrangements had to be reorganized to provide supplies from Roman territory rather than local sources. His intelligence networks had to be expanded to operate in hostile environments, and his administrative procedures had to accommodate the challenges of governing populations whose loyalty was uncertain. The siege of Avaricum demonstrated both the administrative capabilities that Caesar had developed and the challenges that systematic resistance presented to Roman governmental systems. The siege required coordinating the activities of multiple legions for extended periods while maintaining supply lines that stretched back to Roman territory. Caesar's engineers had to construct siege works under constant harassment. His administrators had to organize supplies for forces operating in hostile territory, and his diplomatic efforts had to balance military necessity with the political requirements of maintaining relationships with tribal allies. Caesar's victory at Avaricum provided him with supplies and resources that enabled him to continue operations against Vercingetorix's coalition, but it also demonstrated the administrative costs of systematic resistance and the challenges that sustained military operations presented to Roman governmental systems. The siege had consumed enormous quantities of supplies and equipment, while requiring administrative innovations that strained Caesar's logistical and organizational capabilities. The climactic siege of Alesia represented the ultimate test of the administrative systems that Caesar had developed throughout his Gallic campaigns. The siege required him to construct elaborate fortifications that could simultaneously contain a large enemy force within the town while protecting Roman forces from relief armies approaching from outside. This double circumvallation project represented one of the most complex engineering and administrative undertakings of ancient warfare. The administrative challenges of the Alesia siege included coordinating the activities of multiple legions and auxiliary units over several months while maintaining supply lines, communication networks, and the specialized equipment required for sustained siege operations. Caesar's engineers had to construct miles of fortifications. His administrators had to organize supplies for tens of thousands of troops, and his diplomatic efforts had to maintain the loyalty of tribal allies while demonstrating Roman determination to achieve decisive victory. Caesar's victory at Alesia marked not just the military defeat of Gallic resistance, but also the administrative triumph of Roman organizational superiority over tribal coalition strategies. The siege demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman engineering, logistics, and coordination while establishing the precedents and procedures that would guide subsequent Roman siege warfare throughout the imperial period. The administrative aftermath of Alesia required Caesar to reorganize the governmental systems of his Gallic provinces to accommodate the reality of complete Roman control while providing mechanisms for tribal populations to participate in imperial administration. This involved developing new procedures for taxation, legal administration, and economic development that would facilitate the integration of Gallic territories into the broader Roman Empire. Caesar's treatment of Vercingetorix and other resistance leaders reflected his understanding that sustainable imperial administration required balancing demonstrations of Roman power with respect for local leadership and political traditions. His decision to spare most tribal leaders while publicly executing the most prominent resistance figures established precedents for imperial administration that balanced security requirements with political necessity. The consolidation of Caesar's Gallic conquests required developing administrative systems that could maintain Roman control with minimal military presence, while facilitating the economic and political development that would integrate these territories into the broader imperial system. This involved establishing urban centers that could serve as administrative focal points, developing transportation networks that could facilitate commerce and communication, and creating educational and cultural institutions that could promote Roman values while respecting local traditions. By the conclusion of his Gallic campaigns in 50 BCE, Caesar had not only conquered vast territories and defeated formidable enemies, but had also created administrative innovations and governmental procedures that would serve as models for Roman imperial administration for centuries. His hybrid legal systems, multinational military structures, and economic development programs established precedents that would be applied throughout the Roman Empire, while his communication networks, logistical procedures, and coordination mechanisms demonstrated the administrative capabilities required for effective imperial governance. Yet, Caesar's success in Gaul had also created political challenges that would soon require him to apply his administrative and military capabilities to very different problems. His achievements had enhanced his political position in Rome, while also arousing the suspicion and opposition of rivals, who viewed his power and popularity as threats to their own ambitions. The transition from provincial governor to political competitor would require the same sort of systematic preparation and administrative competence that had characterized his Gallic career. But it would also test his understanding of Roman institutions and his ability to navigate political challenges that were far more complex than any military opposition he had faced in Gaul. How would Caesar manage this transition from military success to political advancement? How would the administrative skills and organizational innovations that had served him so well in Gaul adapt to the very different challenges of Roman domestic politics? The answers to these questions would emerge from the same methodical approach to strategic planning and systematic preparation that had distinguished his entire career. But they would be tested by opponents who understood Roman political systems, as well as Caesar understood Roman military administration. As Caesar's proconsular command in Gaul approached its scheduled termination in 50 BCE, the question of his future status within the Roman constitutional system became the focus of increasingly complex legal, political, and administrative maneuvering that would ultimately determine not just his personal career, but also the survival of the Roman Republic itself. The seemingly straightforward matter of whether Caesar would be permitted to seek the consulship while retaining his military commanda, privilege that would protect him from prosecution by his political enemies, required navigating constitutional precedents, legal interpretations, and procedural requirements that had evolved over centuries of republican governance. The constitutional crisis that developed around Caesar's status reflected fundamental tensions within Roman governmental systems that had been building for decades as the practical requirements of imperial administration increasingly conflicted with traditional republican institutions designed for governing a city-state. Caesar's proconsular authority in Gaul had been extended through legislation that stretched traditional constitutional boundaries, while his military achievements had provided him with resources and popularity that exceeded the capacity of normal republican procedures to accommodate safely. Caesar's political position in 50 BCE was complicated by the complex web of legal requirements, constitutional traditions, and political relationships that governed the careers of Roman magistrates. Roman law required candidates for high office to present themselves personally in Rome during prescribed campaign periods. But it also prohibited holders of military commands from entering the city while retaining their imperium. Caesar's proconsular authority protected him from prosecution by his enemies, but only as long as he remained outside Rome with his armies. His political survival, therefore, required either securing permission to stand for consul in absentia, rare exception to normal procedures, or negotiating guarantees that would protect him from prosecution after he relinquished his command. The administrative complexity of resolving Caesar's constitutional situation was compounded by the fractured state of Roman politics. As the first triumvirate had dissolved following the death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, in 54 BCE, and the death of Crassus in 53 BCE, without the informal arrangements that had previously coordinated the activities of Rome's most powerful politicians, the Senate and popular assemblies became arenas for increasingly bitter conflicts between competing factions whose disagreements extended far beyond Caesar's immediate situation to encompass fundamental questions about the direction of Roman governance. Caesar's efforts to resolve his constitutional difficulties required extensive correspondence with political allies in Rome, careful coordination with supporters in various governmental institutions, and the sort of systematic legal research that could identify precedents and procedures that might provide solutions to his problems. His staff in Gaul included legal specialists who analyzed constitutional questions, political advisors who monitored developments in Rome, and administrative personnel who maintained communication networks connecting Caesar's provincial headquarters with supporters throughout the Roman world. The complexity of Caesar's legal situation was illustrated by the multiple overlapping issues that had to be resolved simultaneously. His proconsular command had been extended through 49 BCE, but the specific terms of that extension were disputed by political opponents, who argued that his authority had already expired or would expire before he could legally seek higher office. His eligibility for the consulship was complicated by questions about whether his service in Gaul satisfied residency requirements and whether his status as proconsul disqualified him from seeking civilian office. His protection from prosecution depended on maintaining his imperium, but the legal basis for that protection was disputed by enemies who argued that his proconsular authority did not extend to immunity from criminal charges related to his earlier career. Caesar's political allies in Rome, led by the tribunes Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius Longinus, attempted to resolve these constitutional questions through legislation that would grant Caesar the specific exceptions he required. However, their efforts were consistently obstructed by conservative senators who used procedural devices, religious objections, and systematic filibustering to prevent votes on proposals that might establish precedents for future strongmen seeking to circumvent traditional constitutional limitations. The political maneuvering around Caesar's status consumed months of Senate sessions, popular assemblies, and private negotiations that involved dozens of major political figures and hundreds of minor officials, clients, and supporters. Each proposal and counterproposal required extensive legal analysis, constitutional research, and political coordination that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy, while preventing the Roman government from addressing other pressing issues. The paralysis that resulted from this constitutional crisis demonstrated both the complexity of Roman governmental procedures and their vulnerability to systematic obstruction by determined opponents. Caesar's analysis of his political situation led him to conclude that his enemies were determined to destroy him regardless of constitutional proprieties or legal precedents, and that his survival required either complete capitulation, which would result in his prosecution, conviction, and exile, or resistance that might preserve his position but would necessarily involve civil war. This assessment was based on detailed intelligence about the activities and intentions of his opponents, careful analysis of political alignments within various Roman institutions, and realistic evaluation of the resources and capabilities that that different factions could mobilize in support of their positions. The prospect of civil war was not a dramatic decision made in a moment of passion, but rather the result of systematic analysis of political alternatives and their likely consequences. Caesar's staff prepared detailed assessments of the military forces that could be mobilized by different factions, the political loyalties of governors and commanders throughout the Roman world, and the financial resources that would be required to sustain extended military operations. These preparations were conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized Caesar's Gallic campaigns, but they were focused on the very different challenges of warfare against Roman opponents who understood Roman military systems and possessed comparable resources and capabilities. Caesar's decision to demand that both he and Pompey simultaneously disband their armies represented his final attempt to resolve the constitutional crisis through negotiation rather than force. This proposal was designed to address conservative concerns about military strongmen while protecting Caesar from prosecution by removing the military resources that his enemies would require to enforce their will. The rejection of this proposal by Pompey and his allies convinced Caesar that civil war was inevitable and that his survival required immediate military action. The administrative preparations for Caesar's march on Rome required transforming his provincial governmental apparatus into a military command structure capable of conducting operations against Roman opponents throughout the Mediterranean world. This involved reorganizing his intelligence networks to provide information about political and military developments in Roman territories, adapting his logistical systems to support campaigns in regions where local cooperation could not be assumed, and developing new procedures for managing relationships with populations whose loyalty to different Roman factions was uncertain or divided. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River on January 10th or 11th, 49 BCE, marked not just the beginning of civil war, but also the initiation of the most complex administrative and logistical challenge of his career. Unlike his Gallic campaigns, which had involved extending Roman authority over foreign populations, the civil war required him to establish and maintain control over territories and populations that were already part of the Roman system, while simultaneously conducting military operations against opponents who possessed comparable organizational capabilities and resources. The symbolic significance of crossing the Rubicon was matched by its practical importance as an administrative and legal boundary that separated Caesar's provincial authority from the jurisdiction of Roman civilian government. By bringing his armies across this boundary, Caesar was not just declaring war against his political opponents, but also challenging the fundamental constitutional principle that separated military and civilian authority within the Roman system. The administrative consequences of this action would require him to develop new forms of governmental organization that could function effectively in territories where traditional Roman institutional structures were disputed or non-functional. Caesar's immediate military objectives after crossing the Rubicon were relatively straightforward: seize key strategic points in northern Italy, neutralize potential opposition, advance toward Rome before his opponents could organize effective resistance, but achieving these objectives required complex administrative and logistical arrangements that had to be improvised under the pressure of active military operations. His forces had to be supplied and equipped for campaigns in Roman territory where requisitioning could provoke political opposition. His intelligence networks had to provide information about the loyalties and capabilities of local officials and military commanders. And his diplomatic efforts had to balance military necessity with the political requirements of presenting his cause as legitimate defense of republican institutions. Caesar's rapid advance through northern Italy demonstrated both his understanding of Italian political geography and his ability to adapt his administrative systems to the unique challenges of civil warfare. His seizure of Aramina, modern Rimini, provided him with a strategic base and demonstrated his commitment to military action, while his subsequent capture of additional towns established momentum that discouraged potential opponents and encouraged neutrals to cooperate with his forces. The administrative challenges of occupying Roman territory were significantly different from those that Caesar had encountered during his Gallic campaigns. In Gaul, Caesar had been establishing Roman authority over populations that were unfamiliar with Roman governmental systems and could be gradually introduced to imperial administration. In Italy, he was operating in territories where Roman governmental structures already existed and where local officials, military commanders, and civilian populations had established loyalties and relationships that complicated his efforts to assert control. Caesar's approach to these challenges reflected his understanding that success in civil war required not just military victory, but also political legitimacy that could justify his actions and attract support from populations whose cooperation was essential for sustained success. His proclamations and public statements emphasized his commitment to defending republican institutions against the tyrannical ambitions of his opponents. While his administrative policies were designed to demonstrate that his rule would be more competent and beneficial than that of his rivals, the speed of Caesar's advance and the effectiveness of his propaganda created a cascade of defections and submissions that nearly eliminated organized resistance in northern Italy within weeks of his crossing the Rubicon. Town after town opened its gates to his forces. Local officials declared their support for his cause, and military commanders who had initially prepared to resist either fled or negotiated terms for joining his armies. This rapid political collapse reflected both the effectiveness of Devites' administrative and propaganda efforts and the limited popular support for his opponents. Pompey's decision to evacuate Rome rather than defend the city represented a strategic calculation that civil war could not be won through control of individual locations, but would instead require systematic mobilization of resources and capabilities throughout the Roman world. This strategic withdrawal, while politically damaging, reflected Pompey's realistic assessment of his immediate military capabilities and his understanding that sustainable victory would require time to organize the superior resources that his control of eastern provinces and foreign alliances could potentially provide. Caesar's occupation of Rome presented him with unprecedented administrative challenges, as he now possessed theoretical authority over the center of Roman government, but lacked the institutional legitimacy that normally accompanied such authority. His administration had to function through existing Roman governmental structures while simultaneously justifying his irregular path to power and preparing for continued military operations against opponents who controlled vast resources and territories throughout the Mediterranean world. The administrative apparatus that Caesar established in Rome attempted to balance respect for traditional republican forms with the practical requirements of governing during civil war. He maintained the Senate, popular assemblies, and magistrates, but ensured that they were staffed by supporters or neutrals who would cooperate with his policies. He respected property rights and legal procedures, but adapted them to accommodate the exceptional circumstances of his rule. He preserved religious ceremonies and cultural traditions, but used them to reinforce his political legitimacy and demonstrate his commitment to Roman values. Caesar's financial administration during his occupation of Rome required accessing the resources of the Roman treasury while avoiding the sort of systematic plundering that would undermine his political legitimacy or provoke popular resistance. His seizure of the treasury's gold reserves was technically illegal, but practically necessary for funding continued military operations. While his efforts to minimize disruption to normal commercial and financial activities were designed to maintain economic stability and popular support, the complexity of Caesar's administrative situation in Rome was compounded by the need to prepare for continued military operations while simultaneously governing territories under his control and managing relationships with neutral or uncommitted populations throughout the Roman world. His staff had to coordinate military preparations with civilian administration, balance immediate strategic requirements with long-term political objectives, and maintain communication and coordination across vast distances with limited and unreliable communication networks. Caesar's brief stay in Rome, lasting only a few days, reflected his understanding that his position could not be secured through control of the city alone, but would require systematic defeat of his opponent's military forces and the establishment of undisputed authority throughout the Roman world. His departure from Rome to pursue Pompey demonstrated his recognition that civil war was fundamentally a military rather than political contest, and that victory would require the same sort of systematic campaign planning and execution that had characterized his Gallic operations. Yet as Caesar departed Rome to begin the Mediterranean-wide military operations that would determine the outcome of the civil war, he carried with him not just the authority of Roman governmental institutions, but also the administrative experience and organizational capabilities that had distinguished his entire career. His success in the Civil War would depend not just on tactical superiority or strategic vision, but on the same methodical preparation, careful coordination, and systematic attention to detail that had enabled him to conquer Gaul and establish himself as one of Rome's most formidable political leaders. How would Caesar apply these administrative capabilities to the unprecedented challenges of conducting civil war against opponents who possessed comparable resources and understood Roman systems as well as he did? The answer would emerge from the campaigns that followed, but it would be determined by the same bureaucratic competence and organizational innovation that had characterized his approach to every previous challenge in his career. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey and his allies throughout the Mediterranean world required him to adapt his administrative and logistical systems to support military operations across vast distances, in unfamiliar territories, and against opponents who possessed intimate knowledge of Roman military capabilities and could deny him the local cooperation that had facilitated his Gallic campaigns. The sheer geographic scope of the civil war encompassing Spain, Gaul, Italy, the Balkans, Asia Minor, Egypt, and North Africa demanded logistical innovations and administrative coordination that exceeded anything attempted in previous Roman military history. The strategic complexity of Caesar's position following his occupation of Rome was compounded by the fact that Pompey's withdrawal to the eastern Mediterranean had provided his opponents with access to the vast resources of Rome's wealthiest provinces while simultaneously forcing Caesar to pursue them across territories where his own logistical networks were limited or non-existent. Pompey controlled the eastern provinces that provided Rome with much of its grain supply, commanded the loyalty of numerous client kings and allied states, and possessed the naval superiority that would allow him to interrupt Caesar's communications and supply lines while maintaining his own. Caesar's first major strategic decision whether to pursue Pompey immediately into the eastern Mediterranean or first secure his position in the western provinces required systematic analysis of logistical capabilities, political alignments, and military resources that consumed weeks of planning and consultation with his staff. The decision to campaign first in Spain reflected his understanding that Pompey's supporters in that region posed an immediate threat to Caesar's position in Gaul and Italy, while also providing him with opportunities to gain experience in civil war operations before confronting Pompey's main forces in more challenging theaters. The administrative preparations for Caesar's Spanish campaign required reorganizing his governmental and military apparatus to support operations across the Pyrenees, while maintaining control over his existing territories in Gaul and Italy. This involved establishing new communication networks that could coordinate activities across multiple theaters, developing logistical systems that could supply armies operating hundreds of miles from their bases, and creating administrative procedures that could manage the complex political relationships between Roman factions in disputed territories. Caesar's Spanish opponents, led by Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius, commanded forces that were comparable to his own in size and quality, while operating in territories where they enjoyed significant local support and intimate knowledge of terrain and resources. Unlike his previous campaigns against tribal opponents who were unfamiliar with Roman military systems, Caesar now faced commanders who had been trained in the same military schools, understood the same tactical principles, and possessed access to equivalent equipment and organizational capabilities. The campaign of Ilerda demonstrated both the effectiveness of Caesar's administrative innovations and the challenges that civil warfare presented to traditional Roman logistical systems. Caesar's initial advance into Spain was hampered by flooding that disrupted his supply lines and allowed Pompey's commanders to concentrate superior forces against his divided armies. Recovery from these early setbacks required improvising new supply arrangements, rebuilding damaged infrastructure, and adapting tactical plans to accommodate terrain and weather conditions that had not been anticipated in his original preparations. Caesar's solution to his Spanish logistical difficulties involved constructing bridges, establishing new supply routes, and developing alternative sources of provisions that could maintain his forces even when traditional supply lines were interrupted. His engineers built pontoon bridges to replace structures destroyed by flooding. His administrators negotiated with local suppliers to supplement stocks transported from Gallic and Italian bases. And his intelligence networks provided information about enemy movements and capabilities that enabled him to avoid disadvantageous engagements. While seeking opportunities for decisive action, the administrative complexity of the Alerta campaign was illustrated by Caesar's need to coordinate multiple columns, advancing through difficult terrain while maintaining communication with distant headquarters and managing relationships with Spanish populations whose loyalties were divided between competing Roman factions. His forces had to adapt to Spanish military practices and geographical conditions, while maintaining the tactical coherence and logistical efficiency that distinguished Roman armies from their opponents. Caesar's victory in Spain was achieved not through dramatic battles, but through systematic maneuvering that gradually isolated his opponents and demonstrated the superior effectiveness of his administrative and logistical systems. His ability to maintain his forces in difficult conditions while disrupting enemy supply lines eventually forced Afranius and Petreius to seek terms, ending organized Pompeian resistance in Spain without requiring the sort of costly siege operations that had characterized some of his Gallic campaigns. The administrative aftermath of Caesar's Spanish victory required establishing governmental structures that could maintain his control over the region while providing resources and personnel for continued operations in other theaters. This involved appointing reliable administrators to key positions, negotiating agreements with Spanish tribal leaders and urban communities, and creating financial arrangements that could extract resources for the broader Civil War effort, while avoiding the sort of systematic exploitation that might provoke local resistance. Caesar's return to Rome following his Spanish victory provided him with the opportunity to consolidate his political position and prepare for the Eastern campaigns that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Civil War. His brief second visit to the capital was devoted primarily to administrative activities, reorganizing governmental institutions, securing additional resources for military operations, and managing the complex political relationships that sustained his authority in Italy and Gaul. The most significant administrative challenge of Caesar's second stay in Rome was organizing the financial and logistical resources required for amphibious operations across the Adriatic Sea, transporting multiple legions and their equipment across water barriers required constructing specialized ships, training personnel in amphibious warfare techniques, and developing supply systems that could maintain armies operating in territories where local support was uncertain and enemy naval forces could threaten communication lines. Caesar's preparations for his Eastern campaigns involved coordinating the activities of shipbuilders throughout Italy, negotiating with maritime suppliers for specialized equipment and provisions, and establishing communication networks that could coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple theaters. His administrative staff expanded to include naval specialists, amphibious warfare experts, and regional advisors who possessed knowledge of political and military conditions in the territories where he planned to operate. The crossing of the Adriatic in January 48 BCE required coordinating the movements of hundreds of ships, carrying thousands of soldiers and enormous quantities of equipment across winter seas that were notorious for their unpredictability and danger. The logistical challenges were compounded by Pompey's naval superiority, which forced Caesar to attempt the crossing despite adverse conditions and with inadequate transport capacity for his entire army. Caesar's initial landing in Epirus, with only part of his forces, created immediate administrative and strategic challenges. as he had to establish supply lines and defensive positions, awaiting for the remainder of his army to complete the hazardous sea crossing. His advance inland required adapting his logistical systems to operate in territories where Pompey's supporters controlled most resources and where local populations were either hostile or cautiously neutral, pending the outcome of military operations. The administrative complexity of Caesar's eastern operations was illustrated by his need to coordinate land and naval activities across hundreds of miles of coastline while maintaining communication with supporters in Magnicia and managing relationships with various Balkan tribes and Greek cities whose cooperation was essential for sustained operations. His intelligence networks had to provide information about Pompey's movements and capabilities, while his diplomatic efforts attempted to secure local alliances that could supplement his limited resources. Caesar's siege operations around Dyrrhachium demonstrated both the challenges of conducting civil war in territories where both sides possessed comparable capabilities and the importance of administrative competence in determining the outcome of seemingly tactical engagements. Pompey's superior position and resources enabled him to maintain adequate supplies, while Caesar's forces faced increasing shortages that ultimately forced him to abandon the siege and seek more favorable terrain for decisive operations. The administrative lessons of Dyrrhachium led Caesar to modify his strategic approach, emphasizing mobility and seeking engagements where his tactical superiority could overcome Pompey's advantages in resources and position. His withdrawal from the siege and subsequent maneuvering in Thessaly reflected his understanding that success in civil war required balancing immediate tactical considerations with longer-term strategic objectives and administrative capabilities. The Battle of Pharsalus represented the culmination of months of administrative preparation and strategic maneuvering that had gradually shifted the balance of capabilities between Caesar and Pompey. Caesar's victory was achieved through tactical innovations that exploited his understanding of Pompey's likely battle plan. But it was made possible by administrative and logistical preparations that had maintained his army's effectiveness despite operating in hostile territory with limited resources. The administrative aftermath of Pharsalus required Caesar to manage the complex political and military consequences of decisive victory over his primary opponents, while simultaneously preparing for continued operations against remaining Pompeian forces throughout the Mediterranean world. His treatment of captured opponents, distribution of rewards to his supporters, and reorganization of territories that had supported Pompey all required careful attention to political as well as administrative considerations. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey to Egypt involved further administrative challenges, as he had to maintain adequate forces for continued operations while ensuring the loyalty of newly conquered territories and managing relationships with various eastern kingdoms and client states whose cooperation was essential for sustained Roman control. His small force that landed in Egypt reflected both the limited naval transport available and his assessment that political rather than military factors would determine Pompey's fate. Pompey's assassination by agents of Ptolemy XIII deprived Caesar of the opportunity to demonstrate clemency toward his primary opponent. But it also eliminated the most serious threat to his authority while creating new challenges related to Egyptian politics and the broader Eastern Mediterranean balance of power. Caesar's subsequent involvement in Egyptian affairs reflected both his personal relationship with Cleopatra and his understanding that control over Egypt's resources was essential for financing continued civil war operations. The Alexandrian War that followed Caesar's arrival in Egypt required him to adapt his military and administrative capabilities to urban warfare in one of the Mediterranean world's most complex and sophisticated cities. The siege of Alexandria involved not just military operations, but also negotiations with various Egyptian factions, coordination with regional allies, and management of supply lines that extended back to Roman territory across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile seas. Caesar's administrative handling of Egyptian affairs during and after the Alexandrian War established precedents for Roman relationships with client kingdoms, while demonstrating his understanding that effective imperial governance required balancing direct control with accommodation of local political structures and cultural traditions. His support for Cleopatra provided Rome with a reliable ally who controlled Egypt's vast resources, while his administrative arrangements established frameworks that would facilitate continued Roman influence without requiring permanent military occupation. The conclusion of Caesar's Egyptian operations provided him with the resources and political legitimacy required to complete his victory in the Civil War. But it also demonstrated the enormous administrative challenges that accompanied success in such vast and complex conflicts. His control over Egypt's wealth enabled him to finance continued military operations, while his victory over Pompey's most capable lieutenants established his reputation as Rome's most effective military commander. Yet significant Pompeian forces remained active in Asia Minor, North Africa, and Spain, requiring Caesar to continue the systematic military and administrative efforts that had already consumed 3 years and vast resources. His brief campaign against Pharnax II in Asia Minor and his subsequent operations against Cato and Scipio in North Africa would require the same methodical preparation and administrative coordination that had characterized his entire civil war effort. How would Caesar manage the final phases of the Civil War while simultaneously establishing the governmental structures that would be required for governing the territories he had conquered? The answer would emerge from the same systematic approach to strategic planning and administrative management that had distinguished his entire career. But it would be tested by challenges that exceeded even those he had already overcome. Caesar's return to Rome in 46 BCE, as undisputed master of the Roman world, marked the beginning of perhaps the most intensive period of administrative innovation and governmental reform in Roman history, as he attempted to establish institutional frameworks that could effectively govern territories spanning from Britain to Egypt while addressing the political, economic, and social disruptions that had resulted from decades of civil warfare. The transformation of Roman governmental structures to accommodate imperial responsibilities required systematic revision of laws, procedures, and administrative arrangements that had evolved over centuries of republican development. The scope of Caesar's administrative responsibilities as dictator exceeded those of any previous Roman leader, as he possessed not just the traditional emergency powers of the dictatorship, but also the proconsular authority over multiple provinces and the political support that derived from his unprecedented military achievements. His governmental apparatus had to coordinate activities across territories that encompassed dozens of different linguistic groups, legal traditions, and economic systems, while maintaining the efficiency and effectiveness that Roman administration had demonstrated throughout the Mediterranean world. Caesar's approach to governmental reform reflected his understanding that sustainable imperial authority required not just political control, but also administrative competence that could provide concrete benefits to populations throughout the Roman world, while respecting local traditions and accommodating regional differences. His reforms attempted to balance the centralization required for effective coordination with the flexibility needed to govern diverse populations, whose cooperation was essential for long-term stability. The most visible of Caesar's administrative innovations was his reform of the Roman calendar, a project that required extensive consultation with astronomers and mathematicians, while addressing practical problems that had plagued Roman governmental and commercial activities for generations. The traditional Roman calendar had become so inaccurate that seasonal festivals were occurring at inappropriate times of year, while the political manipulation of calendar adjustments had created uncertainty that complicated legal proceedings, commercial contracts, and administrative planning. Caesar's calendar reform involved replacing the traditional lunar-based system with a solar calendar that included 365 days per year, plus an additional day every 4th year to account for the astronomical realities of Earth's orbit around the Sun. This seemingly technical adjustment required extensive administrative coordination, as it affected legal proceedings throughout the Roman world. Commercial contracts that specified delivery dates, religious festivals that were tied to particular calendar dates, and military operations that depended on seasonal timing. The implementation of calendar reform required Caesar's administrators to coordinate with officials throughout the Roman world, ensuring that the new system was understood and adopted uniformly while accommodating local customs and religious practices that might be affected by the changes. The project demonstrated both Caesar's attention to administrative detail and his understanding that effective governance required addressing practical problems that affected the daily lives of millions of people. Caesar's legal reforms were even more extensive and significant as he attempted to systematize and codify Roman law in ways that would facilitate uniform administration throughout the Roman world while accommodating the diverse legal traditions that existed in different regions of the empire. His legal innovations included standardizing procedures for criminal and civil cases, establishing uniform criteria for citizenship and legal status, and creating mechanisms for appealing decisions and resolving disputes between different legal jurisdictions. The complexity of Caesar's legal reforms was illustrated by his efforts to address the problems of debt and land distribution that had contributed to the social tensions underlying the civil wars. His debt relief measures required detailed analysis of economic conditions throughout the Roman world, careful calibration of policies that would provide genuine assistance to debtors while avoiding the sort of wholesale debt cancellation that could destabilize credit markets and discourage future commercial investment. Caesar's land distribution programs represented even more complex administrative challenges, as they involved identifying suitable territory for settlement, coordinating the relocation of veteran soldiers and urban poor, and establishing the agricultural and commercial infrastructure required to support new communities. These programs required extensive surveying and mapping, negotiation with existing landowners and communities, and the creation of administrative structures that could manage ongoing relationships between settlers and their neighbors. The financial administration of Caesar's expanded governmental responsibilities required systematic revision of Roman taxation and revenue collection systems to accommodate the increased costs of imperial administration while avoiding the sort of oppressive exploitation that could provoke resistance or rebellion. His financial innovations included establishing more efficient procedures for tax collection, creating uniform currency standards throughout the Roman world, and developing new sources of revenue that could support expanded governmental activities. Without overwhelming taxpayer capacity, Caesar's urban planning and public works projects in Rome itself required coordinating the activities of thousands of workers while managing the complex logistics of construction in a densely populated city, where normal commercial and residential activities had to continue. His projects included expanding the Forum, constructing new public buildings, improving water supply and drainage systems, and creating recreational facilities that could accommodate Rome's growing population. The administrative challenges of Caesar's public works programs included recruiting and training specialized craftsmen, organizing the transportation of construction materials from throughout the Mediterranean world, and coordinating the activities of multiple construction projects that were proceeding simultaneously. These projects demonstrated both Caesar's understanding of the political importance of visible governmental achievements and his commitment to practical improvements that would enhance the quality of life for Roman citizens. Caesar's provincial administration reforms addressed the systematic problems that had plagued Roman governance in territories throughout the Mediterranean world, as he attempted to establish uniform standards for provincial governors, while providing mechanisms for oversight and accountability that could prevent the sort of exploitation and corruption that had characterized many previous provincial commands. His administrative innovations included standardizing procedures for tax collection and legal administration, establishing regular communication between provincial headquarters and Rome, and creating appeals processes that could address complaints. About governmental abuse. The complexity of provincial administration under Caesar's reforms was illustrated by his efforts to balance the autonomy required for effective, local governance with the coordination needed for imperial coherence. Provincial governors retained significant discretionary authority over local affairs, but they were required to follow standardized procedures for major policy decisions and to maintain regular correspondence with central authorities about their activities and achievements. Caesar's military administration reforms established the frameworks that would govern Roman armed forces for centuries, as he systematized recruitment procedures, standardized training and equipment, and created career advancement opportunities that would attract capable personnel to military service. His innovations included establishing uniform pay scales and benefits for different types of military service, creating standardized procedures for veteran settlement and retirement, and developing training programs that could maintain military effectiveness while accommodating the diverse populations that served in Roman armies. The administration of Caesar's veteran settlement programs required extensive coordination between military and civilian authorities, as hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to be provided with land, agricultural equipment, and the support services required to establish successful farming communities. These programs involve surveying and distributing vast territories, providing initial financial support for new settlers, and creating the commercial and administrative infrastructure that could sustain veteran communities over extended periods. Caesar's social and cultural policies attempted to address the demographic and cultural challenges that had emerged as Rome evolved from a city-state to a Mediterranean empire. His citizenship reforms expanded access to Roman legal status while maintaining the distinctions that preserved traditional Roman identity and political structures. His cultural policies promoted Roman educational and artistic traditions while accommodating the diverse cultural heritage of populations throughout the empire. The administrative implementation of Caesar's citizenship reforms required extensive bureaucratic coordination, as millions of people throughout the Roman world had to be registered, classified, and integrated into Roman legal and political systems. This involved creating new administrative procedures for determining citizenship status, establishing mechanisms for appeals and dispute resolution, and coordinating between central and local authorities to ensure uniform application of citizenship policies. Caesar's religious reforms addressed the complex relationships between Roman state religion and the diverse religious traditions that existed throughout the empire. His policies attempted to maintain Roman religious authority while accommodating local religious practices and creating mechanisms for resolving conflicts between different religious communities. These reforms required extensive consultation with religious authorities throughout the Roman world and careful attention to the political and cultural sensitivities associated with religious diversity. The complexity of Caesar's religious cues administration was illustrated by his appointment as Pontifex Maximus, a position that required him to oversee religious ceremonies and interpret religious law while simultaneously managing the political and military responsibilities of the dictatorship. His religious policies had to balance respect for traditional Roman religious practices with the practical requirements of governing territories where different religious traditions were deeply embedded in local political and social structures. Caesar's commercial and economic policies attempted to address the disruptions that had resulted from decades of civil warfare while establishing frameworks for sustained economic development that could support the expanded governmental activities required for imperial administration. His policies included standardizing commercial law and procedures throughout the Roman world, establishing uniform currency and measurement systems, and creating infrastructure that could facilitate trade and commerce across vast distances and diverse economic systems. The administrative challenges of implementing Caesar's economic reforms included coordinating between local and imperial authorities, managing the transition from diverse local systems to uniform imperial standards, and providing the technical assistance and resources required for successful implementation. These reforms demonstrated Caesar's understanding that sustainable political control required not just military dominance, but also economic prosperity that could provide concrete benefits to populations throughout the Roman world. Yet even as Caesar was establishing these comprehensive administrative reforms, he was also confronting the political opposition that would ultimately result in his assassination. The scope and pace of his innovations had alarmed conservative senators who viewed his reforms as threats to traditional republican institutions and Roman cultural values. The concentration of authority required for effective implementation of his programs had created the appearance of tyrannical rule that violated fundamental Roman political principles. The administrative apparatus that Caesar had created to implement his reforms became the foundation for imperial governmental structures that would endure for centuries. But it also demonstrated the tensions between effective administration and republican political traditions that would plague Roman governance. Throughout the imperial period, his systematic approach to governmental innovation had addressed many practical problems of imperial administration. But it had also raised fundamental questions about the compatibility of imperial responsibilities with republican institutions. As Caesar contemplated his future plans, including possible campaigns against the Parthian Empire and additional territorial expansion, he faced the challenge of consolidating his administrative achievements while addressing the political opposition that threatened his personal survival and the continuity of his reforms. How would he balance the requirements of continued governmental innovation with the political necessities of maintaining support among Roman elites whose cooperation was essential for sustained success? The answer to this question would emerge from the events of the Ides of March, but it would be determined by the same systematic approach to strategic planning and administrative management that had characterized Caesar's entire career. For Caesar's legacy would be measured not just by his military conquests or political achievements, but by the administrative innovations and governmental structures that would shape Roman imperial development for centuries to come. Caesar's assumption of the title dictator perpetuo in February 44 BCE represented not merely a dramatic political gesture, but rather the culmination of a systematic administrative revolution that had been transforming Roman governmental structures throughout his periods of supreme authority. The perpetual dictatorship was less a radical departure from established Roman practice than it was the logical extension of administrative innovations that had already rendered traditional republican institutions inadequate for governing an empire that now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River and from the North Sea to the Sahara Desert. The practical implications of perpetual dictatorship required Caesar to establish administrative frameworks that could function indefinitely without the periodic disruptions that had characterized republican government, where annual elections, term limitations, and collegial authority had regularly interrupted policy implementation and institutional development. Caesar's administrative apparatus had to accommodate not just the immediate requirements of imperial governance, but also the long-term challenges of maintaining institutional continuity, training successive generations of administrators, and adapting governmental structures to evolving political and economic conditions. The bureaucratic infrastructure that Caesar developed to support perpetual dictatorship represented one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in ancient history, incorporating innovations in record-keeping, communication networks, personnel management, and policy coordination that would serve as models for imperial governments throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. His governmental apparatus included specialized departments for military affairs, provincial administration, financial management, legal proceedings, public works, religious ceremonies, and foreign relations, each staffed by personnel who possessed the technical expertise required for effective performance of their responsibilities. Caesar's approach Two administrative personnel reflected his understanding that effective governance required not just political loyalty, but also technical competence that could ensure accurate implementation of complex policies across vast territories and diverse populations. His administrative staff included traditional Roman aristocrats whose political connections and cultural authority enhanced governmental legitimacy, but also freedmen, foreigners, and technical specialists whose expertise was essential for managing the practical challenges of imperial administration. The complexity of Caesar's personnel management was illustrated by his efforts to balance the competing requirements of political reliability, administrative competence, and representative diversity. In appointments to key governmental positions, his administrators had to possess sufficient authority to command respect from local elites while maintaining the flexibility required to adapt imperial policies to regional conditions and cultural traditions. This balance required sophisticated evaluation procedures and ongoing oversight mechanisms that could identify and address performance problems while maintaining institutional continuity. Caesar's financial administration during the perpetual dictatorship required systematic revision of Roman governmental accounting and budgetary procedures to accommodate the expanded scope and complexity of imperial responsibilities. His financial innovations included establishing centralized accounting systems that could track revenues and expenditures across multiple provinces and governmental departments, creating standardized procedures for budget preparation and approval, and developing oversight mechanisms that could detect and prevent corruption or mismanagement. The administrative challenges of Caesar's financial management were compounded by the diverse economic systems that existed throughout the Roman world, as his accounting procedures had to accommodate different currencies, legal frameworks, and commercial practices while providing the uniform information required for effective central planning and resource allocation. His financial administrators developed conversion procedures that could translate local, economic data into standardized formats, communication networks that could rapidly transmit financial information across vast distances, and analytical techniques that could identify trends and patterns in imperial economic activity. Caesar's legal administration during the perpetual dictatorship involved systematizing and codifying Roman law in ways that would facilitate uniform application throughout the empire while accommodating local legal traditions and cultural practices. His legal innovations included establishing standardized procedures for civil and criminal cases, creating mechanisms for appeals and dispute resolution, and developing training programs that could ensure consistent interpretation and application of legal principles by judges and administrators throughout the Roman world. The complexity of Caesar's legal reforms was illustrated by his efforts to integrate Roman legal principles with local legal traditions in ways that would provide effective governance, while respecting cultural diversity and maintaining popular support. His legal code attempted to establish uniform standards for fundamental issues such as property rights, commercial contracts, and criminal procedures, while allowing regional variation in areas where local practices were compatible with Roman strategic requirements and administrative capabilities. Caesar's provincial administration during the perpetual dictatorship required developing systematic procedures for appointing, training, and overseeing the governors and administrators who exercised imperial authority in territories throughout the Mediterranean world. His administrative innovations included establishing standardized procedures for governor selection and evaluation, creating communication networks that could maintain regular contact between provincial headquarters and central authorities, and developing oversight mechanisms that could detect and address problems in provincial administration. The administrative challenges of provincial governance under Caesar's system were compounded by the diversity of territories under Roman control, as his procedures had to accommodate regions with sophisticated urban civilizations, tribal societies with warrior-based political structures, and everything in between. Provincial administrators required not just general governmental competence, but also specialized knowledge of local conditions, cultural sensitivities, and political relationships that could affect the success or failure of imperial policies. Caesar's military administration during the perpetual dictatorship established the frameworks that would govern Roman armed forces for centuries. As he systematized recruitment, training, equipment, and career advancement procedures while creating institutional computal concali. Elite, my modulation, astectic computi. It's my safetude, my modulo side is contuing. As computi side, to acute comedy, it's compuki q. So we becad. I be unqueus, my I we side, it is it. It is it. It is it all re it. I deca it is I wide lit bick it on a tie it up bet so I lease it to casit to slit isks to kick it by I to cos it it sis it's I sit it net to this is to think to keep up to let you but avoid the wisp some best and it buzz structures that could maintain military effectiveness across vast territories and diverse operational environments. His military innovations included standardizing pay scales and benefits, establishing uniform training procedures and equipment specifications, and creating career advancement opportunities that could attract capable personnel to military service. The complexity of Caesar's military administration was illustrated by his efforts to integrate professional legions with auxiliary forces recruited from throughout the empire, creating unified command structures that could coordinate diverse military capabilities while maintaining the tactical superiority that distinguished Roman armies from their opponents. His military administrators developed training programs that could accommodate different military traditions and capabilities, logistical systems that could support multinational forces operating in various environments, and command procedures that could coordinate complex operations across vast distances and challenging terrain. Caesar's public works administration during the perpetual dictatorship involved coordinating massive construction projects throughout the Roman world, including roads, aqueducts, harbors, public buildings, and urban infrastructure that would facilitate commercial development, improve public health and safety, and demonstrate the power and competence of imperial administration. His construction programs required sophisticated project management capabilities, extensive logistical coordination, and careful attention to architectural and engineering standards that would ensure long-term durability and functionality. The administrative challenges of Caesar's construction programs included recruiting and training specialized craftsmen, organizing the transportation of construction materials across vast distances, and coordinating multiple simultaneous projects, while maintaining quality control and adherence to budgetary constraints. His public works administrators developed procurement procedures that could identify and secure the materials and expertise required for successful completion of complex projects, transportation networks that could move enormous quantities of materials across difficult terrain, and oversight mechanisms that could ensure adherence to architectural specifications and construction schedules. Caesar's urban planning initiatives in Rome itself represented the most visible demonstrations of his administrative capabilities, as he attempted to transform the physical infrastructure of the capital city to accommodate its growing population, while creating impressive architectural monuments that would symbolize the power and sophistication of imperial government. His urban development projects included expanding the Forum, constructing new public buildings, improving water supply and drainage systems, and creating recreational facilities that could serve the diverse needs of Rome's cosmopolitan population. The complexity of Caesar's urban planning was illustrated by his efforts to balance the practical requirements of urban infrastructure with the political and cultural significance of architectural symbolism. His building projects had to provide genuine improvements in urban functionality, while also serving as propaganda tools that would reinforce his political authority and demonstrate the benefits of imperial governance. This required sophisticated understanding of both engineering capabilities and popular psychology, as well as careful coordination between technical specialists and political advisors. Caesar's religious administration during the perpetual dictatorship required managing the complex relationships between Roman, state religion, and the diverse religious traditions that existed throughout the empire. His religious policies attempted to maintain Roman religious authority while accommodating local religious practices and creating mechanisms for resolving conflicts between different religious communities. These policies required extensive consultation with religious authorities throughout the Roman world and careful attention to the political and cultural sensitivities associated with religious diversity. The administrative challenges of Caesar's religious governance were compounded by his role as Pontifex Maximus, which required him to oversee Roman religious ceremonies and interpret religious law while simultaneously managing the political and military responsibilities of the perpetual dictatorship. His religious administrators had to coordinate ceremonial activities throughout the Roman world, maintain the temples and religious facilities that served diverse populations, and provide the religious legitimation that enhanced governmental authority while respecting local religious traditions. Caesar's educational and cultural policies during the perpetual dictatorship attempted to address the challenges of maintaining Roman identity and values while governing territories with diverse cultural traditions and educational systems. His cultural initiatives included promoting Roman educational standards and literary traditions, while supporting local cultural activities that were compatible with Roman political objectives. These policies required sophisticated understanding of the relationships between cultural identity and political loyalty, as well as practical mechanisms for implementing educational and cultural programs across vast territories with diverse populations. The administrative implementation of Caesar's cultural policies required coordinating between central authorities and local communities, providing financial support for educational and cultural activities, and creating oversight mechanisms that could ensure adherence to Roman standards while respecting local traditions. His cultural administrators had to balance the promotion of Roman values with accommodation of regional diversity, creating educational programs that would produce competent administrators and loyal citizens while maintaining the cultural vitality that contributed to imperial prosperity. Caesar's diplomatic administration during the perpetual dictatorship involved managing relationships with client kingdoms, allied states, and potential enemies throughout the known world. His diplomatic policies required maintaining the delicate balance between Roman dominance and regional autonomy that characterized successful imperial relationships, while also preparing for potential military conflicts that might threaten Roman security or expansion opportunities. The complexity of Caesar's diplomatic administration was illustrated by his efforts to coordinate relationships with dozens of different political entities, each with its own internal politics, external relationships, and strategic capabilities. His diplomatic staff included regional specialists who possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions and political relationships, communication networks that could rapidly transmit information and instructions across vast distances, and analytical capabilities that could assess the implications of regional developments for broader Roman strategic interests. Yet even as Caesar was establishing these comprehensive administrative frameworks for perpetual governance, he was also planning additional military campaigns that would further expand Roman territories and create new administrative challenges. His projected campaigns against the Parthian Empire and possible operations in northern Europe would require adapting his governmental systems to accommodate even greater territorial scope and cultural diversity, while maintaining the efficiency and effectiveness that had characterized his existing administrative achievements. The administrative preparations for Caesar's planned Eastern campaigns required coordinating military recruitment and supply arrangements with the ongoing requirements of imperial governance, ensuring that expanded military operations would not disrupt the governmental systems that maintained control over existing territories. His military administrators had to develop logistical capabilities that could support major campaigns while maintaining adequate forces for provincial security and frontier defense. As Caesar contemplated these future challenges, he also faced the growing opposition of senators and other Roman elites who viewed his administrative innovations and expanded authority as threats to traditional republican institutions and Roman cultural values. The very effectiveness of his governmental systems had created concerns about the recent concentration of power and the potential for tyrannical abuse that violated fundamental Roman political principles. The tension between administrative effectiveness and republican political traditions would ultimately determine not just Caesar's personal fate, but also the future development of Roman governmental institutions and the broader question of whether imperial responsibilities could be reconciled with republican political values. How would Caesar address these political challenges while maintaining the administrative continuity required for effective imperial governance? The answer to this question would emerge from the events that followed, but it would be shaped by the same systematic approach to institutional development and political management that had characterized Caesar's entire administrative career. For the future of the Roman world would depend not just on the resolution of immediate political conflicts, but on the durability and adaptability of the administrative structures that Caesar had created to govern an empire of unprecedented scope and complexity. The conspiracy that would ultimately cost Caesar his life emerged not from spontaneous outrage or sudden political crisis, but rather from months of careful planning, systematic recruitment, and the sort of methodical organizational work that characterized Roman political activity at its most sophisticated level. The formation of the conspiracy required coordinating the activities of dozens of senators and other political figures while maintaining absolute secrecy, developing detailed operational plans that could succeed despite the extensive security arrangements that protected the dictator, and creating the political justifications that would legitimize their actions to the Roman people and senatorial colleagues. The administrative challenges facing Caesar's opponents were comparable in complexity to those involved in any major political or military undertaking, as they had to identify and recruit reliable conspirators, coordinate their activities across extended periods, and prepare for the political aftermath of assassination while avoiding detection by Caesar's intelligence networks and security personnel. The success of the conspiracy would depend not just on the dramatic moment of assassination, but on the careful preparation and systematic coordination that preceded it. The leadership of the conspiracy was assumed by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, both experienced politicians whose family backgrounds and personal relationships provided them with access to the networks of connection and influence that would be essential for recruiting additional conspirators and legitimizing their cause. Brutus, in particular, possessed symbolic authority as a descendant of the legendary founder of the Republic, while Cassius brought practical experience in military and administrative affairs that would be crucial for planning and executing their operation. The recruitment of conspirators required systematic evaluation of potential participants' reliability, motivation, and capabilities, as the success of their enterprise depended on maintaining absolute secrecy while involving sufficient numbers of senators to provide political legitimacy and operational capability. Each recruitment approach required careful preparation, as potential conspirators had to be sounded out without revealing the full scope of the conspiracy, while their responses had to be evaluated to determine their suitability for participation. In such a dangerous enterprise, the diversity of the conspiracy's membership reflected the complex political motivations that drove opposition to Caesar's rule, as conspirators included traditional Republicans who objected to the concentration of power in a single individual, personal rivals who resented Caesar's dominance, provincial senators who felt excluded from the benefits of imperial governance, and younger politicians who viewed the conspiracy as an opportunity for personal advancement. Managing this diverse coalition required sophisticated understanding of individual motivations and careful attention to the political dynamics that could either sustain or destroy conspiratorial unity. The operational planning for Caesar's assassination required detailed intelligence about his daily routines, security arrangements, and schedule of public appearances. Information that had to be gathered without arousing suspicion among Caesar's supporters or security personnel. The conspirators had to identify opportunities when Caesar would be accessible to assassination while evaluating the risks associated with different approaches and locations. This intelligence gathering required systematic observation over extended periods and careful coordination. Among multiple sources of information, the selection of the Senate meeting on the Ides of March as the occasion for assassination reflected careful analysis of the political and practical advantages that this setting would provide. The Senate House offered a public venue that would give their actions, political legitimacy while providing access to Caesar without requiring them to overcome his personal security arrangements. The timing coincided with Caesar's planned departure for his Parthian campaign, creating urgency that justified decisive action while ensuring that the conspiracy would not have future opportunities for comparable access. The complexity of the assassination plan required coordinating the activities of more than 60 conspirators while ensuring that their actions would appear to be a legitimate political proceeding rather than a criminal assault. The conspirators had to position themselves strategically throughout the Senate chamber, coordinate their approach to Caesar, and ensure that their collective action would overwhelm any resistance while maintaining the political symbolism that would justify their cause to observers and posterity. Caesar's behavior on the morning of March 15, 44 BCE, suggested that he was aware of potential threats to his safety, but had chosen to proceed with his scheduled activities rather than alter his routine in ways that might suggest fear or weakness. His decision to dismiss his personal bodyguard and attend the Senate meeting demonstrated either confidence in his political security or resignation to the risks that accompanied his position. Contemporary sources suggest that he had received warnings about potential dangers but had chosen to disregard them as either unreliable intelligence or unavoidable hazards of political leadership. The actual assassination was accomplished through coordinated action by the conspirators who surrounded Caesar and inflicted multiple wounds that ensured his death while demonstrating their collective responsibility for the deed. The attack was swift and decisive, overwhelming Caesar's ability to resist or escape while providing the political symbolism that the conspirators required to justify their actions as legitimate defense of Republican institutions rather than criminal murder. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed both the careful planning that had preceded the deed and the limitations of the conspirators' preparation for managing its political consequences. While they had successfully eliminated Caesar, they had not adequately prepared for the practical challenges of maintaining political control in the volatile situation that would follow his death. Their failure to secure key strategic points in Rome, neutralize Caesar's supporters, or coordinate with potential allies outside the city would prove crucial to the ultimate failure of their political objectives. The conspirators' proclamation of their motives and objectives following the assassination demonstrated their understanding that political legitimacy required not just successful action, but also effective propaganda that could convince the Roman people and senatorial colleagues that their deed was justified by higher principles rather than personal ambition or factional rivalry. Their emphasis on defending Republican institutions and eliminating tyrannical rule was designed to appeal to traditional VL political values, while obscuring the personal and factional motivations that had also contributed to their actions. Caesar's funeral arrangements became the focus of intense political maneuvering, as different factions attempted to use the ceremonial proceedings to advance their respective interpretations of his life, death, and legacy. Mark Antony's funeral oration transformed what the conspirators had intended as a celebration of Republican restoration into a demonstration of popular loyalty to Caesar's memory and hostility toward his assassins. The reading of Caesar's will, which included generous bequests to the Roman people and provided for public use of his private gardens, further enhanced his posthumous popularity while undermining the conspirators' political position. The administrative apparatus that Caesar had created to govern the Roman world faced immediate challenges following his death, as the sudden removal of central authority created uncertainty about the continuity of governmental policies and the loyalty of provincial governors and military commanders. The conspirators had eliminated the dictator but had not developed alternative institutional arrangements that could maintain effective governance during the transition period, creating opportunities for ambitious politicians and military commanders to advance their own interests at the expense of Republican restoration. The complexity of the political situation following Caesar's assassination was compounded by the existence of multiple competing factions, each with different objectives and capabilities. The conspirators themselves were divided between those who sought immediate return to traditional Republican procedures and those who recognized that some accommodation with Caesarian supporters would be necessary for political survival. Caesar's supporters included both genuine believers in his political program and opportunists who had benefited from his patronage and feared the consequences of Republican restoration. Mark Antony's position as consul provided him with significant advantages in the political maneuvering that followed Caesar's death, as he possessed constitutional authority and access to governmental resources that enabled him to coordinate resistance to the conspirators while positioning himself as Caesar's political heir. His control over Caesar's papers and personal effects gave him opportunities to influence the interpretation of the dictator's policies and intentions, while claiming authorization for actions that advanced his own political position. The emergence of Octavian, later Augustus, as a competitor for Caesar's political legacy created additional complications for all parties, as his adoption in Caesar's will gave him legal claim to the dictator's name and inheritance, while his youth and inexperience made him appear less threatening than more established political figures. The competition between Antony and Octavian for control of Caesar's supporters and resources would ultimately determine the fate of both the conspirators and the broader Republican cause. The provincial and military responses to Caesar's assassination varied significantly based on local conditions, personal loyalties, and strategic calculations about the likely outcome of the political struggle in Rome. Some governors and commanders immediately declared their support for the conspirators and Republican restoration, while others maintained loyalty to Caesar's memory and policies. Many adopted wait-and-see positions that reflected uncertainty about the ultimate distribution of power and the wisdom of premature commitment to any particular faction. The administrative continuity of Roman governmental operations during the months following Caesar's assassination demonstrated both the institutional strength that his reforms had created and the vulnerabilities that resulted from excessive dependence on personal authority. Essential governmental functions continued to operate in most provinces and departments, but major policy decisions were delayed or disputed as competing factions claimed authority, and provincial administrators sought guidance from uncertain central authorities. The financial implications of Caesar's assassination were particularly significant, as his death created immediate uncertainty about the continuity of his financial policies and the validity of commitments that had been made in his name. His generous bequests to the Roman people and his supporters created financial obligations that strained governmental resources while providing political ammunition for those who sought to claim his legacy. The competition for control over his personal wealth and governmental revenues became a crucial factor in the broader political struggle. Caesar's planned Parthian campaign was immediately cancelled following his assassination, eliminating the military and political opportunities that he had intended to use for further expansion of Roman power and enhancement of his personal authority. The extensive preparations for this campaign, including recruitment, supply arrangements, and diplomatic initiatives, represented enormous investments of resources and political capital that were lost as a result of his death. The broader implications of Caesar's assassination extended far beyond the immediate political crisis in Rome, as his death created uncertainty about Roman policy and capabilities throughout the Mediterranean world. Client kings and allied states had to recalculate their relationships with Rome based on new leadership and potentially different policies, while potential enemies sought to exploit the apparent weakness and division that Caesar's death had revealed. The administrative legacy of Caesar's governmental innovations would prove more durable than his personal authority, as many of the institutional frameworks and procedures that he had established continued to function effectively under his successors. His calendar reform, legal codes, administrative procedures, and provincial arrangements provided foundations for imperial governance that would endure for centuries, even as the political system that he had created to support his personal rule was dismantled and replaced. Yet the immediate consequence of Caesar's assassination was not the Republican restoration that his killers had intended, but rather a renewal of civil warfare that would ultimately destroy the Republican system entirely and establish the imperial autocracy that Caesar's opponents had sought to prevent. The failure of the conspiracy to achieve its political objectives would demonstrate the gap between successful tactical execution and effective strategic planning, while also revealing the inadequacy of traditional Republican institutions for governing the vast territories and diverse populations of the Roman Empire. How would the Roman world respond to this sudden elimination of its most powerful leader? How would the administrative systems that Caesar had created adapt to function without his direct oversight and authority? The answers to these questions would emerge from the chaotic political struggles that followed, but they would be shaped by the institutional foundations and administrative innovations that Caesar had established during his years of supreme power. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination on March 15, 44 BCE, revealed both the fragility of personal rule and the remarkable durability of the administrative systems that he had established during his years of unprecedented authority. While the conspirators had successfully eliminated the dictator himself, they discovered that dismantling the governmental apparatus he had created was a far more complex undertaking than assassinating its creator. The institutional frameworks, procedural innovations, and administrative personnel that Caesar had assembled continued to function with surprising effectiveness even after his death, providing continuity that helped prevent the complete collapse of imperial governance while also facilitating the eventual restoration of autocratic/elise, a wadocratic/ruby-kiss. Ruby-kiss, ruby-kiss, only ruby-kiss. Only ruby-kiss has the luxurious move/kiss, mizzle/case, and lice-kiss, los, last s, collide/rude. Wall/collage/collage/collage/renoise. L/collast/renoise. We/realize/nude/lies bisalize collad with /karina and insitol isamic asatol sisit lisakakris to kai mas kibiets secret misa malas to kektak with the saib. Rule under his adopted heir, the Roman governmental system that continued to operate following Caesar's death was fundamentally different from the republic that had existed before his rise to power. As his administrative innovations had created new institutions, established new procedures, and trained new personnel whose capabilities and loyalties reflected the requirements of imperial rather than city-state governance. The Senate, popular assemblies, and magistrates that resumed their functions after March 15th were operating within governmental frameworks that Caesar had systematically modified to accommodate the realities of ruling a Mediterranean-wide empire. With diverse populations, complex economies, and extensive military commitments, Caesar's administrative personnel, many of whom were freedmen, foreigners, and technical specialists rather than traditional Roman aristocrats, possessed irreplaceable expertise in the practical operation of imperial governmental systems. Their knowledge of provincial conditions, financial procedures, legal precedents, and administrative protocols enabled them to maintain governmental continuity during the political chaos that followed Caesar's death. The conspirators, despite their success in eliminating Caesar, lacked both the technical expertise and institutional knowledge required to operate the governmental systems they had inherited. The complexity of Caesar's administrative legacy was illustrated by the challenges that confronted Mark Antony as he attempted to assert control over the governmental apparatus following Caesar's death. As surviving consul, Antony possessed constitutional authority over many governmental functions, but he lacked detailed knowledge of the administrative innovations and institutional relationships that Caesar had developed. His effectiveness as chief magistrate depended heavily on his ability to retain and coordinate the activities of Caesar's administrative personnel, many of whom possessed political loyalties and technical capabilities that could not be easily replaced. Antony's access to Caesar's personal papers and governmental records provided him with crucial intelligence about ongoing policies, financial commitments, and administrative arrangements that enabled him to present himself as the legitimate successor to Caesar's authority, while also providing him with detailed information about governmental operations that his rivals lacked. His control over this administrative archive became a significant political asset that enhanced his position in the competition for power that followed Caesar's assassination. The financial administration of the Roman state continued to operate under systems that Caesar had established, as his innovations in accounting procedures, revenue collection, and expenditure management had created institutional capabilities that could function effectively even without direct supervision by the dictator. The treasury continued to collect taxes from provinces throughout the Roman world. Governmental salaries and expenses continued to be paid according to established procedures, and public works projects continued to progress under arrangements that Caesar had initiated. Yet the financial implications of Caesar's death were enormous, as his assassination eliminated the central authority that had coordinated financial policy while creating immediate obligations related to his funeral, his bequests to the Roman people, and the settlement of his personal debts and governmental commitments. The competition for control over Caesar's wealth and the governmental resources that he had commanded became a crucial factor in the political struggles that followed his death. Caesar's military administration continued to function through the command structures and procedural arrangements that he had established. But his death created immediate questions about the loyalty of provincial governors and military commanders whose authority derived from his appointments and whose political survival might depend on the outcome of struggles for succession. Some commanders immediately declared their continued loyalty to Caesar's memory and policies, while others sought to position themselves advantageously for the political competition that was clearly developing. The response of Caesar's veteran soldiers to his assassination demonstrated both their personal loyalty to their commander and their practical dependence on the governmental systems that provided their pay, supplies, and prospects for retirement benefits. Many veterans had been settled in colonies that Caesar had established throughout the Roman world, where their prosperity and security depended on continued imperial support for their communities. Their political loyalties would prove crucial to determining the success or failure of various claimants to Caesar's legacy. Caesar's legal and judicial administration continued to operate under the codes and procedures that he had established, providing institutional continuity that helped maintain order throughout the Roman world. During the political uncertainty that followed his death, provincial governors continued to adjudicate legal cases according to Caesar's legal innovations, while courts in Rome continued to function under procedural arrangements that he had instituted. The durability of these legal frameworks demonstrated their practical effectiveness while also providing political legitimacy for those who claimed to be continuing. Caesar's governmental program, the provincial administration that Caesar had established, proved particularly resilient, as his governors and administrators possessed both the institutional authority and practical capabilities required to maintain effective governance in their assigned territories. Most provinces continued to operate under arrangements that Caesar had established, with tax collection, legal administration, and military security continuing according to established procedures. The effectiveness of provincial governance under Caesar's systems provided practical arguments for continuity rather than radical change in imperial administration. Caesar's urban planning and public works projects in Rome and throughout the empire continued to progress under the administrative arrangements that he had established, demonstrating the institutional momentum that his governmental systems had achieved. Construction projects that he had initiated continued toward completion, while maintenance and operation of infrastructure that he had created continued under established procedures. The visible success of these projects provided tangible evidence of the benefits of Caesar's rule while creating practical arguments for continuing his policies. The calendar reform that Caesar had implemented continued to operate with the technical accuracy and administrative efficiency that had justified its adoption, providing practical benefits to commercial, legal, and administrative activities throughout the Roman world. The success of this seemingly technical innovation demonstrated the broader effectiveness of Caesar's systematic approach to governmental reform while providing a permanent reminder of his administrative capabilities. Caesar's religious and ceremonial innovations continued to function through the institutional arrangements and personnel that he had established, maintaining the religious legitimacy that enhanced governmental authority, while providing mechanisms for popular participation in imperial governance. The religious ceremonies and festivals that he had instituted or modified continued to operate according to established procedures, providing institutional continuity that helped maintain social stability during political uncertainty. The educational and cultural policies that Caesar had initiated continued to operate through the administrative frameworks and institutional arrangements that he had created, promoting Roman values and administrative capabilities while accommodating regional diversity and cultural traditions. The schools, libraries, and cultural institutions that he had established or supported continued to function according to their founding purposes, training personnel and promoting intellectual development that supported the broader objectives of imperial governance. The diplomatic relationships that Caesar had established with client kingdoms, allied states, and tribal groups throughout the known world continued to operate through the treaty arrangements and institutional mechanisms that he had created. Foreign rulers who had developed relationships with Caesar faced difficult decisions about their continued loyalty to Rome and their relationships with competing claimants to his authority. But the diplomatic frameworks that he had established provided mechanisms for managing these transitions. The emergence of Octavian as a claimant to Caesar's political legacy was facilitated by his legal adoption and his access to the financial resources that Caesar had accumulated. But his success would ultimately depend on his ability to master and operate the administrative systems that his adoptive father had created. Octavian's youth and inexperience required him to rely heavily on Caesar's administrative personnel and institutional arrangements while gradually developing his own capabilities for imperial leadership. The eventual triumph of Octavian in the civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination would result not just from his military victories, but also from his systematic mastery of the administrative capabilities that Caesar had developed and his successful adaptation of Caesar's institutional innovations to the requirements of his own rule. The governmental system that emerged under Augustus would incorporate many of Caesar's administrative innovations, while modifying them to accommodate different political circumstances and leadership styles. The transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire was facilitated by the institutional foundations that Caesar had established during his years of supreme authority. His administrative innovations had demonstrated the practical superiority of systematic imperial governance over traditional republican institutions, while his personnel and procedures provided the technical capabilities required for effective autocratic rule. The durability of his governmental systems provided both practical models and political legitimacy for the imperial system that would govern the Roman world for centuries. Yet the broader, historical significance of Caesar's administrative legacy extended far beyond its immediate political consequences. As his governmental innovations established precedents and procedures that would influence institutional development throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. His systematic approach to imperial administration, his integration of diverse populations and territories, and his balance between central coordination and regional autonomy would provide models for subsequent empires and governmental systems. Throughout history, Caesar's administrative innovations had addressed fundamental challenges of governing large, diverse populations across vast territories, challenges that would confront every subsequent imperial system. His solutions to problems of communication, coordination, resource allocation, and cultural accommodation would be studied, adapted, and applied by governmental systems throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The institutional frameworks that he created would prove more durable and influential than his personal authority, providing foundations for governmental development that would endure long after the specific political circumstances that had produced them were forgotten. The bureaucratic apparatus that Caesar had created to govern the Roman world would continue to evolve and adapt under his successors. But its fundamental characteristics, systematic organization, technical expertise, administrative continuity, and institutional flexibility would remain central to imperial governance throughout the ancient period. His example would demonstrate both the possibilities and the challenges of systematic administrative innovation, while his legacy would provide both inspiration and cautionary lessons for subsequent rulers who sought to create effective governmental systems for complex, diverse societies. The story of Caesar's rise, rule, and assassination thus becomes not just a tale of individual ambition and achievement, but also an illustration of the broader historical processes through which effective governmental institutions emerge, develop, and adapt to changing circumstances. His career demonstrated the crucial importance of administrative competence in political success, while his legacy would continue to influence governmental development long after the specific details of his personal story had faded from immediate relevance. In the end, perhaps the most significant aspect of Caesar's extraordinary life was not the dramatic moments of military conquest or political crisis that have captured the attention of historians and storytellers, but rather the patient, methodical development of administrative capabilities that enabled him to govern effectively and created institutional foundations that would serve as models for centuries of subsequent governmental development. His true legacy lay not in the spectacular achievements that made him famous, but in the boring, systematic work of institutional innovation that made effective imperial governance possible. And so, as you drift toward sleep, remember that history is rarely made in moments of high drama, but rather through the accumulated weight of countless small decisions, administrative innovations, and bureaucratic improvements that, taken together, transform the world in ways that no single battle or dramatic gesture ever could. Caesar's true greatness lay not in crossing the Rubicon or conquering Gaul, but in the methodical development of governmental capabilities that enabled human societies to organize themselves more effectively and create the foundations for the complex civilizations that followed. Sleep well, knowing that the most important changes in human history often emerged not from excitement and drama, but from exactly the sort of careful, systematic, and deliberately boring work that has occupied us this evening.